Don't panic. Ch11, Black Market Beats. Chapter Synopsis. So they've finally made it to Winterfell. Sirius sets out to meet the locals, and the locals get the dubious honor of meeting Sirius. Where the locals learn never to trick a marauder, and Sirius teaches the town some new beats. Here comes the sun indeed. Last time, we travel to see the world, not necessarily through any effort to turn profit. Money is not so much of a concern for us, Harry said, hinting at the hidden wealth of gold galleons hidden safely stored away in their trunks. It's merely through convenience, and an interest in helping the small folk we encounter, that we carry goods with us for trade. If this were true, Edwyle thought, it would connect quite a few dots. Especially with regard to their generosity and the surprisingly high-quality goods they carried. He also concluded that if they were legitimately hobbyist traders, and what a strange concept that was to consider, it would also explain their occasional incompetence with their horse and cart. The sooner you start selling, the better. While you won't find any starving mouths in Winterfell, the town has been on rations for months now. I'm sure the people will be more than happy to take their fill of any fresh food you have on offer. A stable boy will show you to the market, and you can set up wherever you like. Chapter 11, Black Market Beats. Leaving Harry up in the library with the maester, Sirius and Dobby re-emerged from the castle gates pushing their cart, which Sirius had already lightened with some surreptitious featherlight charms. They were making their way down into Winter Town to set up a merchant stand in the local market. The town itself actually lay sprawled out to the south of the castle, nestled at the base of the hill upon which Winterfell was perched and surrounded by its own formidable stone wall. As they exited the gates, they had a magnificent view of the town spread out below them. The town straddled the freshwater streams that wound around the base of the hill. The streams continuing on to join the White Knife River, which was just visible in the distance, providing a source of fresh drinking water for the town's people. With a keen eye, Sirius could also see the famous hot water springs bubbling up through the ground in a number of public squares which had clearly sprung up around the locations to benefit from their warmth during the winters. Sirius admired the way the town was built, with its sturdy stone structures and tightly packed streets. The advantage it offered in a siege was clear, as any invading army would have to divide its attention between the town and the castle to avoid a counterattack from either side. The town and castle would also not want for warmth or fresh water as any besieging army sat in the cold outside the walls. Sirius considered that this Brandon fellow who built the town was clearly a dab hand at town planning. Although the thought crossed his mind that it could also have been the daughter of Peverell they had heard about, who was responsible for the robust natural benefits the town called its own. After all, it wouldn't have been too hard for a well-trained witch to form the streams and hot springs that fed the town. As he approached the town gates, he took in the scattered snow cover and the muddy streets that were an inevitable result of the season. People wearing thick furs bustled about, their breath visible in the cold air as they went about their daily tasks. There was a sense of camaraderie and shared struggle among the townspeople, who faced the harsh northern climate together. Upon entering the town, Sirius was guided by a stable boy to a small market beside the central square. Tipping him a galleon as they parted seemed to garner an extreme response from the boy. Sirius was pretty sure he'd overpaid. He'd need to figure out the local currency and stop giving people coins from their old world. Thankfully he knew Dobby had some gold dragons and other coins tucked away in his pouch ready for use. The market was already bustling with activity, though there were few merchants this early in the season. Even here in the northern capital, trade was slow to start as winter ended. Still, it was a more vibrant scene than the other towns they had passed through, where the trio had been the only merchants present. As Sirius prepared to set up his stall, he passed a curious eye over the offerings of the other merchants. Most of them clearly hailing from nearby towns themselves. There were vendors selling the usual northern goods of furs and leather, as well as those offering various types of preserved foods. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of roasting meat from a nearby food vendor. An overweight man wearing an embellished outfit and too many gold rings on his stubby fingers approached the duo as they were setting up. The man had a haughty, overconfident air that Sirius was familiar with from his interactions with many purebloods growing up as a black. Taking an immediate dislike to the man, Sirius braced himself for what he anticipated would be an inevitably tedious interaction. He put on his best pureblood face in preparation, the one that said, "I'm better than you and we both know it." "Good day, sirs. I am Padrick, master of markets in Winter Town," the man announced with excessive pride, his puffed-out chest reflecting his similarly overinflated sense of self-importance. Patrick eyed this new merchant, wondering if he was a little constipated, based on the way he was screwing his face up in such a strange manner. It didn't matter in the end, he'd met plenty of strange traders over the years, he didn't mind as long as they paid up. In that case, it is agreeable to meet you, Master Patrick. I should inform you I will be setting up a stall in the square here for a moon, Sirius replied, unsure of how long he would be staying in the area. I like a man who gets down to business. Patrick replied with an anticipatory gleam in his eyes. That will be 10 dragons for the moon. 15 if you want this prime spot by the hot spring in the center of the square. Even with his rudimentary grasp of the currency, Sirius knew that was more than should be necessary to rent a stall. It was certainly a lot more than the few market squares that had charged for a spot in the towns they had stopped in on the way here. Lord Stark had also already given him permission to set up wherever he wanted, though he would concede that this Patrick fellow had no way to know that yet. He suspected the man was skimming off the top, because Lord Stark didn't seem like the type that would overcharge merchants. Particularly this close to the end of winter. Sirius wasn't particularly concerned with the gold, considering the enormous piles Harry had brought with him from the Potter and Black family vaults. Even still, he made a point of slowly and visibly looking around at the almost empty market square before turning back to Patrick with his eyebrow raised. Patrick's grin turned predatory at the look from Sirius, and the glint in his eye got brighter. It's that or you push that cart of yours to the next town over, he said, holding his hand out for the coin. Sirius made an act of sighing but put his hand in his pocket and drew out a reasonable amount of gold coins and handed it over. He wasn't sure why the house elves had packed leprechaun gold in the trunks for Harry, but he made a point of keeping some with him for occasions just like this. A marauder knew to always be prepared, and Sirius had known it would only be a matter of time before they met someone like Patrick on their travels. He'd have to make sure Harry was prepared as well. Not everyone would be as nice as the lords they'd met in the last few weeks, and the heir to the marauders couldn't be seen as an easy target. Sirius watched Patrick walk away across the square with a spring in his step, carrying the handful of leprechaun gold he'd handed over. Sirius smiled, thinking of the reaction Patrick would have when he found the gold missing in an hour or two. Internally, Sirius resolved to hit Patrick with a prank or two when the opportunity arose. The man could do with a bit of petty revenge. Though Sirius would bide his time for a few days, to ensure no one would connect any mishaps back to him. With Dobby's help, Sirius finished setting up their stall. Something that had become more elaborate as they moved through the villages and became more adept at playing the part of merchants. They were continuing to focus on selling steel tools and fresh food, as these seemed to fill a serious need of the people in this region. These also happened to be goods the storage trunks had in surplus supply. Sirius was pretty sure they'd snap up his precious fire whiskey if offered, but there was no way he would give up his limited supply. Following Harry's agreement with Lord Stark, he steeply discounted the food, and even dropped the price on the tools further than usual. As a final step, he conjured a sign announcing the lower than normal prices and the ready supply of fresh foods. Though come to think of it, he didn't know if any of the townsfolk could read. It seemed the word spread anyway, as a long orderly line soon formed in front of the stall. One by one, the worn-down but hardy-looking residents arrived, clad in their thick furs and eager to purchase the well-priced food for their families. Dobby continued to surreptitiously restock as they sold the goods, ensuring they never ran out. It was easy enough for them to share some food, even under the guise of selling it at ridiculously low prices. There was no need for them to turn anyone away, and Sirius was enjoying his role. After closing the stall for the day, Sirius and Dobby split up to explore Winter Town. Sirius strolled through the central square, taking in the sights and sounds of the lively community. Children played in the snow, their laughter ringing through the air, while adults gathered around fires, most of them enjoying some satisfyingly fresh food they had purchased from Sirius. Sirius observed the small grove of weirwood trees that stood serenely off to one side of the square. The town buildings built a respectable distance back from the grove, which retained its raw beauty. The sight of the ancient trees, their faces carved into the bark, brought a sense of calm and reverence to the bustling town. Their gnarled branches stretched out like arms, as if offering protection to those who sought solace beneath them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sirius wandered through the narrow streets of Winter Town, taking note of the various shops and inns that lined them. He could hear the clanging of a blacksmith's hammer in the distance and the murmur of conversation from within the warm, inviting taverns. As he took in the sights, Sirius couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at the adventure they'd begun, and the small but notable impact their presence was having on the people of the north. Sirius stepped into the inn they had been set up in by Sir Joss at the instructions of Lord Stark. It was certainly one of the nicer-looking taverns and inns he had seen in his brief exploration of the town. The warmth and inviting atmosphere washing over him as he crossed the threshold. The establishment was bustling with activity, as the day's end brought many patrons in for a meal, some of whom seemed to have come especially to take advantage of the unusually fresh food from the kitchen. Sirius knew this food had been bought from his stall in bulk earlier that day, its freshness a result of the preservation charms the elves had employed when it was originally stored. Surveying the scene, Sirius noticed the increasingly inebriated crowd gathered by the bar, their laughter and chatter filling the air. In one corner, a group of bards played lively, Irish-sounding folk songs, their fingers deftly plucking at the strings of their instruments. As they played, they happily accepted the occasional donated coin from appreciative patrons. Feeling the need for a meal and a drink, Sirius approached the bar, addressing the woman he assumed to be the matron in charge. He first requested directions to the room Sir Joss had reserved for them. This would serve as their home base while they stayed in Winterfell and Wintertown. He'd have Dobby set up the tent inside the room when the elf returned from his own explorations. Sirius was also sure to instruct the matron not to have staff enter the room, as no cleaning would be required. Having sorted accommodation, he ordered a meal, and something to quench his thirst. An ale in this case, as the alcohol selection in the north seemed to be exclusively ale or red wine. Sirius wondered why no one seemed to have invented mead at this point. Wasn't that supposed to be a staple of medieval society back in their old world? Something about it being easy to produce with a steady supply of honey. He'd let Harry know to add that to the list in the little notebook he always seemed to be carrying around these days. Mead would be relatively easy to introduce and he would enjoy having a wider selection of drinks. As the woman handed him a tankard, Sirius surreptitiously cast a cleaning charm on it, well aware that hygiene was not a priority in these medieval surroundings. He also lit the candle on his table with a subtle flick of his wand, casting an everlasting flame charm to ensure it would not go out. Settling in for the evening, Sirius reflected on how much better his life had become since Harry's return, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Things had been good with the Thens, albeit a bit too cold for his liking, but now he was on an adventure, living relatively well despite the medieval conditions. Though it was hard to lament any decline in living standards after experiencing Azkaban and Grimmauld Place, he thought with a grimace. He eagerly devoured his vegetable broth and surprisingly fresh bread, pleased that no one seemed to notice or care about his less than refined table manners in this medieval tavern. After finishing his meal, Sirius rose from his seat thinking it might be fun to join the musicians for a set or two. Casting a quick notice me not charm around his table, he pulled an acoustic guitar from his expanded pouch and then cancelled the charm, heading over towards the bards. Sirius had always been a lover of music. Having lessons in singing and various instruments from a young age was still one of the few things he would thank his crazy family for, though he really found his niche when Lily introduced him to the wonders of Muggle rock bands. Looking around at the smiling faces in the tavern eating the fresh food and reveling in the atmosphere, he knew of the perfect song for the occasion. It couldn't hurt to bring some of his favorite songs to this new world after all. With a grin, he stopped in front of the bards who had been eyeing the strange new instrument he carried, as he walked up to them. "Mind if I take a swing at it, fellas?" Sirius asked the skeptical-looking musicians. Giving Sirius a once-over, the leader of the group just shrugged and motioned for Sirius to go ahead. "Great, follow my lead when you get a hang of it," Sirius said while turning around to the rest of the tavern that had slowly gone quiet as they watched the interaction between the bards and the new merchant in town. Looking out over the crowd, Sirius raised his voice so they could all hear him, casting a mild sonorous charm behind his back. "All right, you northerners. This one comes from a group of musicians in the north of my homeland, a place where it rained most of the year and had winters almost as cold as your own. Feel free to sing along when you get the hang of it. It feels like a fitting tune for you lot." With a grin, Sirius started picking at his guitar, causing a simple but beautiful melody to fill the space, followed shortly by his well-trained voice as he began to sing. "Here comes the sun, do. Here comes the sun, and I say, it's all right, little darling, It's been a long cold lonely winter. Little darling, it feels like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun, do. Here comes the sun, and I say. It's all right, little darling, the smiles returning to the faces. Little darling, it feels like years since it's been here. At this point the band and a number of the patrons picked up on the chorus, Here Comes the Sun. They called out as Sirius smiled and continued strumming. A few more verses and he knew he'd have them hooked on the Beatles, just like Lily had done to him so many years ago. He wouldn't be surprised if it became an unofficial anthem for the North. After all, winter might be coming, but so was the sun. Sirius continued to share some of his favorite tunes as the night wore on, and the crowd got larger. Sharing the joy of music and, of course, a few drinks with his new friends. The evening was shaping up to be a pleasant one, as laughter, song, and good company filled the tavern. In the excitement of the night, Sirius completely forgot to cancel the everlasting flame charm on the candle. But as the warm glow flickered in the dimly lit room, it served as a fitting symbol of the light and warmth Sirius had brought to this small corner of Winterfell. Having finished his first foray into the Starks' ancient library records, Harry made his way down to the town, hoping Sirius had sorted out their rooms and set up their tent inside. He did note that Sirius had completely forgotten to send any message regarding the location of their rooms, and he didn't see S or Joss on the way out. Relief washed over Harry when he found Dobby patiently waiting for him at the town gate to lead him to their inn. The town had taken on a different atmosphere in the evening, with lanterns casting a warm glow on the cobblestone streets and the sounds of laughter and music floating in the air. Harry took a moment to appreciate the charm of the place, observing the people as they made their way home or gathered in groups to share stories and news from the day, choosing to ignore the occasional pile of snow as a reminder of the below-freezing weather. He noted that everyone he passed on his way through the town seemed to have a sort of contented air to them, except for that one fellow in the gaudy outfit with too many gold rings that seemed to be getting a good scolding from a tavern owner. Something about a lack of coin. Harry smiled and followed the growing trickle of townspeople that seemed to be heading in the same direction as himself, towards the sounds of music and revelry. Harry's question was answered before he even had a chance to ask, when Dobby happily informed him that Sirius had taken up the guitar and joined the bards in their pub. That certainly explained the crowds. Sirius always had a nice voice. Harry approached the inn to the sound of Here Comes the Sun, by the Beatles. He shook his head ruefully at that. At least it was somewhat simple and reminiscent of the folk songs they'd heard in taverns along the way. Amusedly, he wondered what the townsfolk would think of heavy metal or dubstep. By the time they entered the inn, Sirius had started on another familiar song. Harry smiled as he heard the crowd around Sirius repeating the lyrics of Hungry Like the Wolf as he reached the chorus. This was clearly not the first time Sirius had sung it tonight, and the song seemed to be a crowd favorite. Not surprising, given the direwolf banner that hung on the wall of the tavern above the fireplace. The interior of the inn was cozy and inviting, with wooden beams overhead and a large hearth crackling with fire. The air was filled with the scent of spiced ale and roasted meat, and Harry felt his stomach rumble in response. A few patrons remained around the edges, huddled in corners or chatting with friends, their faces flushed from the warmth of the fire and the effects of strong drink. Deciding to leave Sirius to his revelry, Harry made his way to the back of the tavern where there was a bit more space with just two maids back there busily clearing tables. Another maid stood in the far corner, looking rather frantically at a flaming candle, occasionally blowing at it in an attempt to extinguish the flame. Harry wasn't sure what that was about, but he was impressed by the lasting power of the candle, as it barely flickered at her attempts, almost like an everlasting flame. Impressive candles, he thought absently, as he took a seat near the fire to enjoy the music. After sharing a few more rousing tunes from their old world, Sirius said his goodnights to the bards, dropped some coins in their hat, and joined Harry and Dobby. The trio ascending the creaky wooden stairs to their room. As they walked, Harry couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. Their first day in a proper center of Westerosi civilization could not have gone better, and Harry practically shook with anticipation at all he would learn over the next few weeks as he delved into the library and archives of his distant Stark kin. Whoever said Hermione was the only nerd in the Golden Trio? He thought to himself ruefully. So maybe he had just a little bit of a book-hoarding problem. Who was there to stop him anyway? The next morning, Sirius descended the stairs of the Boar's Inn, still yawning and stretching as he made his way to the common area for breakfast. He absently observed a new small shrine of blue roses that seemed to be offered up to a slowly flickering candle but took no note of it. Clearly some sort of local tradition. Sirius did however note the unwashed bowl on the table and, with a sigh, yet again cast a cleaning charm to sanitize it. As he settled into his seat, he contemplated introducing basic hygiene concepts for the health of the people in Winter Town. He thought over the methods he knew to make soaps from animal fats. Something he picked up back at school, while looking for better ways to clean cauldrons without magic. A favorite form of detention for the teachers of the Marauders. He never thought he'd find another use for that particular knowledge, but now he was sure there were methods he could effectively teach these small folk with little effort. The main process usually involved rendering the fat, which involved slowly heating it to separate the liquid fat from any impurities or solids. Once the fat was rendered, it could be combined with lye, a strong alkaline substance derived from wood ash, to create a chemical reaction that would produce soap. All easy-to-gather ingredients that the locals would have in abundance. Sirius imagined that the townsfolk would be able to collect animal fat from their own livestock or from game they hunted in the surrounding forests. Wood ash would also be readily available, as most households had hearths for warmth and cooking. By teaching the small folk this method, they could create their own soap, which would greatly improve personal hygiene and overall health in the community. If they made enough of the product, they could also start selling it further afield. The town could clearly benefit from some more external trade, and Sirius could benefit from more people having access to soap. It was clearly a win-win situation. Sirius decided to take a note in his journal of ideas and observations that he had started keeping, much like Harry. Though he would admit his journal was notably shorter than Harry's at the moment. He jotted down the idea of introducing soap-making to the people of Winter Town and made a mental note to have Harry add this to his proposals for Lord Stark's improvement projects. It was a small, simple change, but it could have a significant impact on the lives of the people here. As Sirius enjoyed his breakfast, he continued to brainstorm other ways to improve the lives of the people in this medieval land. He knew that the key was to introduce concepts that were practical, sustainable, and easily understood by the small folk. With the support of Lord Stark, he and Harry could kickstart projects that would eventually make a real difference across the North, long after they'd move on in their journey. Chapter 12 Teaser. For Sirius's part, he was already a little bit drunk, having not previously been warned about their clandestine nighttime mission. He wasn't entirely sure what Harry had pulled him into, but strangely enough, it wasn't his first rodeo with grave robbing, so he just went with the flow. "I'm so glad you found me, Harry. I haven't done such weird stuff since back in my Marauder days," he chuckled, while hovering a skull off some more scrolls. Note: the next chapter is now up for free members on Patreon PanGalacticBard. If you would like to make comments or suggestions on the next draft chapter before it's published, you can head over there and have a look. If you would like to read even further ahead, or simply appreciate the story, I would welcome your donations. 2 comments 0 vote. Don't panic CH12. Winterfell and the Chamber of Secrets. Chapter Synopsis. Armed with a journal overflowing with ideas from his home universe, and an overactive, saving people thing, Harry is on a mission to uplift the North. Harry's not going to take no for an answer. Meanwhile, Dobby finds a chamber full of treasure. Oh, and there's some stuff in the crypts too. Last time, I'd hoped that during our stay you might be gracious enough to allow me access to your library. Edwyle contemplated Harry's request a moment, knowing what a boon it would be to grant Harry access the great library at Winterfell. He may not be as wily as his southern counterparts, but Lord Stark knew how to seize an opportunity when he saw it. If they could gain some foreign knowledge or craft from these, likely educated, men who had apparently traveled from distant lands, it could be of great benefit to the North. So few men travel for the purpose of learning, and those that do, he carefully didn't look at the maester as he said this, the knowledge is rarely ever shared. I can perhaps see my way to sharing the great repository that is our Winterfell library, in exchange for some of the more practical learnings and observations you might be able to bring to our attention. Harry didn't even blink at the stipulation or the offer. You have yourself a deal, Harry replied, with a broad smile and a nod. Chapter 12. Winterfell and the Chamber of Secrets. Harry made his way back up to the castle early in the morning. A guard had gone off to fetch someone with authority to allow his entry, and he was subsequently greeted at the gate by Maester Garrick, shuffling toward him in his grey robe and heavy chain. The maester was far too chipper for such an early start. Harry observed inwardly, while still waiting for his own kick of energy from the coffee Dobby gave him earlier. Instead of going back to his investigation of the library, Harry found himself being peppered with questions by the inquisitive Maester. Garrick was keen to get a feel for the learnings and foreign designs or concepts Harry intended to share with the Starks, following their agreement the previous day. Harry was all too happy to share the knowledge, which he attributed to being well-traveled. He'd already jotted down in his journal a number of ideas that he thought might be fairly easy to implement, and should quickly start benefiting the people of Lord Stark's lands. Of course, he intended to draw heavily on his modern-day knowledge, and balancing it to the current level of technology, but the Maester didn't need to know that. The two of them settled in the library in front of a large oak desk, with the Maester happily setting out some inkpots and parchment so they could get started. Harry wasn't sure if the Maester's chipper attitude was down to having found a kindred man of knowledge to share ideas with, or if the Maester was just suffering from that terrible affliction of being a morning person. Deciding to dive right in, Harry began with what he thought would be a somewhat more complex project, though one that had the potential to save a massive amount of labor for the North if implemented correctly. That being the design and planning of water mills and windmills. Drawing a quick diagram, Harry pushed it over to Garrick. "This, my good friend, is going to be the next best thing since sliced bread." Garrick gave him a confused look, probably not quite grasping the diagram. "What do you mean sliced bread? Isn't it easier just to tear hunks off as usual?" That brought Harry up short. Okay, so maybe it wasn't the diagram confusing Garrick. "Never mind the sliced bread," Harry blustered, receiving a raised eyebrow from his companion. "I guess we'll get to that later. It's just an expression where I come from. This mill though," Harry gestured back to the page, "this will revolutionize labor and production in the North." "It certainly did where we come from. Water wheels and windmills can provide mechanical power to perform tasks faster, and with greater output than existing manual methods, and some that are often beyond the capability of normal manpower." Harry now had Garrick's attention as he perused the diagrams. For example, a water wheel can be used to power a mill for grinding grain, which would save an inordinate amount of effort in having individuals manually grinding it by hand. Additionally, it could be used with a few clever additions to power an inhumanly large hammer for faster forging of steel or even pump the bellows for the blacksmith's forge. Harry thought for a moment, then hammered home the opportunity with one last suggestion: "It is also invaluable in speeding up the cutting of lumber. I'll have to draw up a sawmill for you. It will be game-changing in magnifying the supply of wood for your various needs." Going with the flow of thought, Harry added, "With more and cheaper lumber you might even consider riverboat construction." Maester Garrick's eyes widened with interest. Intriguing, intriguing. He paused to contemplate, and decided to explore one of the suggestions that confused him most. "How exactly does the wheel convert the flow of water into the movement of a forge hammer?" Harry hummed for a moment before flipping over one of the diagrams and starting to draw a simpler picture. The water wheel is placed in a stream, where the flow of water causes it to rotate. He explained, demonstrating for Garrick as he spoke. This rotation is then transferred to an axle like that on a cart, which can be connected to gears. Harry of course realized he'd now have to make an attempt at explaining the concept of rudimentary gears. Pulling some more parchment towards him, he both realized he'd be doing a lot of rough diagrams this morning, and also that he should determine what they know of paper production. Continuing to draw and expound on these concepts, Harry settled in for a long but hopefully satisfying lecture. Maester Garrick nodded, clearly impressed after having his eyes open to the various designs and purposes of even the most basic early gear systems. He shuffled through various parchments Harry had scribbled on, trying to absorb the new concepts. Also noting he'd need to order more parchment at this rate. "And what about these windmills you mentioned? How do they work?" Harry acknowledged the question and continued his lecture. "They operate on a similar principle to water wheels, but instead of water, they harness the power of the wind. The wind turns large sails or blades in a circular motion, creating the necessary rotation for an axle and gear system, just like the water wheel." The Maester's curiosity was piqued. These windmills might be even more interesting to us here in the North. With the rivers freezing over in winter, I could see the water wheels being limited to summer activity, useful though they'd be. Harnessing the wind would allow function in far colder weather. Harry nodded along, thankful that the Maester was getting it. As the morning melted into evening, Harry and Maester Garrick delved deeper into the potential designs of water wheels and windmills, discussing how these innovations could revolutionize agriculture, industry, and the daily lives of the small folk in Lord Stark's lands. They started to draw up some initial plans for test builds with great excitement. Over the next 2 days, Harry devoted much of his time to both reading through the Stark library and surreptitiously copying all the books, as well as working with Maester Garrick on detailed diagrams and plans for the construction of their first water wheel and windmill. The pair Garrick was particularly helpful, once he got his head around the concepts. He was clearly born to be a maester, and Harry was definitely impressed. The water wheel would likely be more productive given the consistency of flowing water, and the position of major towns near flowing rivers. The landscape was dotted with quite a few smaller rivers beyond those larger ones like the White Knife. But they'd try to convince Lord Stark to build both, as the windmill had the advantage of not freezing over in winter. Finally, they were satisfied that these 2 project plans were comprehensive enough to be picked up by Lord Stark's carpenters and builders, once they'd pitched them to Lord Stark and received his approval, of course. Maester Garrick packed up the plans to discuss with Lord Stark another day, once he had a better grasp of exactly how many groundbreaking ideas Harry had to offer. They would have to prioritize after all. The treasury was usually fairly limited after summer, and they couldn't try every idea that came up. Calling a servant to bring them some tea, the duo happily settled in to start a new brainstorming session. Harry was already prepared with his next proposal. He had been thinking of the Northern Kingdom's difficulty in growing enough foodstuff to feed its population. The climate was harsh, and the raw, uncultivated landscape didn't help matters. Surely they would fall over themselves for any chance to fix or increase their crop output, and Harry had just what they needed. With that thought, he dove into a lecture on the effectiveness of the 4-field crop rotation method. A technique that would increase crop yields by up to 30%, based on what he indicated were his learnings from other lands, but were actually drawn from his modern-day knowledge and some of the Muggle books in his tent library. Harry explained, the idea is to divide the farmland into 4 separate fields. Each year, you would rotate the crops grown in each field. For example, in the first field, you would grow grains like wheat or barley. In the second field, you would plant legumes, such as beans or peas, which help to replenish the soil's nitrogen content. In the third field, you would grow root crops like turnips or carrots, and in the fourth field, you would let the land lie fallow, allowing it to rest and recover. Giving a moment for the maester to scrawl down notes on these instructions, including a small note to follow up on what nitrogen was, Harry continued, this system will help maintain the fertility of the soil. While it can be tempting to continue to grow as much grain as possible on apparently fertile land, each different crop takes different kinds of nourishment from the soil, and the legumes or your clothes equivalent will add back what the grains take away. Harry spent a little more time explaining the concept of nutrients and nitrogen in the soil. It turned out the concept of nutrients was known to a basic extent, but they weren't aware of how crucial it was to replenish it, nor that it could be replenished by simply growing alternative food crops. They'd instead relied heavily on manure. Harry added that, as a nice bonus, it also tends to reduce the buildup of pests and diseases, as they tend to be crop-specific. By rotating the crops, you break the cycle of pest and disease buildup, leading to healthier crops and improved yields. Even with all this explanation, Maester Garrick was somewhat skeptical that this would work. It seems almost too good to be true, he said, furrowing his brow. While I see the logic in your proposal, Lord Peverell, we must be cautious. Our people depend on the harvests, and any mistake could lead to disaster, starvation specifically. Harry, however, was persuasive, and had the advantage of magic. For the good of all the people here in the north, he cast a weak compulsion and concluded. I understand your concerns, Maester Garrick, but I propose that we try this method at least on the surrounding Winterfell lands, where you and Lord Stark will be able to keep an eye on the process and more easily measure the results. Once you see the benefits with your own eyes, I'm confident that you'll be more willing to share this idea with the other northern lords. After some contemplation, Maester Garrick agreed that it made sense to give the 4-field crop rotation method a try on a smaller scale, as Harry had suggested. They spent the remainder of the day and the following morning discussing the logistics and implementation of the new farming method. They went over the best way to communicate these changes to the farmers, as well as how to monitor progress and troubleshoot any issues that might arise. Together, they considered the likely resistance to change from the local farmers, and subsequently laid out a plan for several meetings and workshops to ensure a smooth transition to the new system. Of course, they would first have to get Lord Stark on board with the ideas, though it shouldn't be too much of an issue as he seemed to put a lot of trust in Maester Garrick. Harry also suggested they ask Lord Stark to personally introduce the concepts to the farmers, as he was well respected by his small folk, and would be readily followed. They had a plan now though, and Harry felt happy that his efforts would soon have a direct and scalable positive impact on the lives of the locals. A few days later, after much time in the library with Maester Garrick and planning with Lord Stark in his solar, Harry took time to get an update on Dobby's Wardstone search. It seems Dobby had more than one discovery to share, and suggested they plan a clandestine trip into the crypts to show him in person. Harry was intrigued. That evening, under the cover of darkness and disillusionment charms, the trio made their way back into Winterfell proper, moving from shadow to shadow for added effect. Quickly venturing out of sight into the lowest levels of the vast Stark family crypts. After clearing up yet another pile of rocks blocking their way, Harry found Dobby waiting expectantly by a blank stone wall. Dobby had been popping through any blockages, simply making a big enough gap to see through and popping to the other side. As Dobby had finally stopped and taken to simply watching Harry with a knowing smile, he got the message that there might be something here. Sirius was casting around with his wand, but Harry instead paused for a moment, internalized his magic, took a deep breath, and pushed, reaching out with his magic to see sense for any clues. Immediately the wispy string of a waiting trigger charm on the wall seemed to snag his magic and test it. Harry recognized this as a family trigger wall, often used in the more sensitive parts of the more ancient family libraries and vaults. The charm must have sensed his Peverell ancestry, and possibly his connection to the Hallows, which was a relief, because he'd not intended to trigger the charm. A failed attempt could be rather nasty depending on the built-in defense mechanisms. Almost immediately a great rumbling began and the wall itself sunk into the floor, revealing a hidden chamber behind. The chamber wasn't grand by any means, almost like it was prepared with great haste. Harry moved into the dimply lit room and was immediately struck by the sight of a beautifully carved weirwood throne sitting in the center. On closer inspection, Harry noted an ornate weirwood crown hung on the left arm. The crown wasn't ostentatious by any means, but held a stark beauty of its own. The silvery white wood of the crown was accented by gems formed of what looked like the fossilized red sap of the trees. A dire wolf head carved out of something that looked like obsidian was inlaid into the centerpiece on the front of the crown. Harry wasn't here for fancy hats though, and he had plenty of jewelry cluttering up his trunk already, so he left the crown where it was and continued to scan the chamber. Behind the chair, Harry spied a small collection of wooden cases. They were covered in dust and dirt, but he could tell they were filled to bursting with gold coins. Taking a closer look, he noted the picture of a wolf stamped on the coins inside. Somewhat different to the dragon and star coins he'd encountered so far. Overall, Harry thought the room had an odd feel to it. With the throne hidden away down here gathering dust and the crown unceremoniously hung on one of the arms. Along with the cases of gold the Starks almost certainly weren't aware of. Harry got the feeling this was all hidden away in a hurry. Maybe it was hidden away to keep these artifacts from the Dragon Lords when they swooped down to demand the North bend the knee. Or maybe earlier, during some other calamity, of which he was sure there were many over the last few thousand of years. Either way, the Starks had either forgotten about this room or had possibly born a generation without enough magic to trigger the door mechanism. Thankfully, Harry was sure the current Lord Stark had enough of a magical core to activate the trigger. The gold was of little interest to Harry, but would make a welcome addition to the Winterfell treasury if he could find a way to surreptitiously point Lord Stark in the right direction. He was sure they'd be excited to find the crown and throne as well. From the bits and pieces of knowledge he had gleaned in the Winterfell library, both artifacts were of great importance to the history for the North. For Harry though, the most important finds were the piles of dusty scrolls and tomes stacked neatly on equally dusty shelves at the back of the room. Seeing this as the opportunity it was, Harry roped both Sirius and Dobby into spending much of the night creating conjured copies of the ancient scrolls so he could study them in detail later. There was bound to be a wealth of knowledge here. He was so gleeful at the find, that he missed both Dobby and Sirius giving him side-eye looks and occasionally making loud exasperated sighs. For Sirius's part, he was already a little bit drunk, having not previously been warned about their clandestine nighttime mission. He wasn't entirely sure what Harry had pulled him into, but strangely enough, it wasn't his first rodeo with grave robbing, so he just went with the flow. "I'm so glad you found me, Harry. I haven't done such weird stuff since back in my marauder days," he chuckled, while hovering a skull off some more scrolls. At a glance the scrolls mainly covered the old Northern Kingdom's history and customs, but to his pleasure, a rare few covered the Stark family magics in the form of warging and greenseeing. Harry had read hints of these magics in other books he'd collected in their travels, but never found any detailed guidance or learning aids. He now had exactly that guidance in his hands. Still more scrolls finally gave him detailed introductions to the first men runes that he'd been so diligently seeking in the library above. Harry noted that he'd have to find some way to thank Dobby for finding this loot, these books. Definitely not loot. Harry didn't have a book-stealing problem. Not at all. Regardless, this find was priceless. After the trio had finished copying and storing all the books, Dobby led them further into the crypts, to his next find. Dobby stopped in front of another wall much deeper in the crypts. In fact, they might have finally reached the end of the crypt tunnels, which wound around in circles, twisting ever deeper under the castle grounds. The walls and looming statues that surrounded them in this section had clearly seen the passing of many thousands of years. This time it was clear the space in front of them was supposed to lead somewhere, being framed by an ornately carved archway, and flanked by the statues of Stark ancestors. Harry almost did a double take when he noticed that the statue of a lady on the left had the symbol of the Hallows carved prominently in the base. This must have been his ancestor, the daughter of Ignotus that married Bran the Builder and started the Stark line. Now this was interesting. If they brought Lord Stark down here, he would be sure to point it out. It was impossible to see if there was any family resemblance given time and damp had worn away the finer features of the statue. Not that it was necessary anyway, given how prominently the living Starks carried the famous dark hair of the Potters and Peverells. Of course, whether they actually brought Lord Stark down here would depend heavily on what they found on the other side of this wall. Harry was excited to see what Dobby had uncovered here. Reaching out with his magic again, Harry felt a similar family trigger mechanism on this wall. This time though, the magic felt more familiar. It was very likely it had been cast directly by a Peverell. For the charm to have maintained its potency all this time was a great indication that whatever lay beyond held a vast amount of magic. The trigger clicked again at feeling Harry's magic and the wall sunk into the floor with another great rumble. Harry quickly cast bubble head charms over the trio as the rumbling created a large plume of ancient dust from tunnel walls. As the dust settled, Harry released the bubbleheads and gasped as he got his first view of a vast wardstone inlaid with obsidian, sitting entwined in the thick roots of what must be an ancient weirwood tree judging by the whitish color. This link to the tree might have been the greatest discovery of the night. After waving his wand over the stone and roots, muttering various diagnostic charms, Sirius noted that the tree seemed to be a conduit, condensing magic from the surrounding air and funneling it into the roots. Following Sirius' various charms with diagnostics of his own, Harry noted that the wardstone in turn appeared to draw magics from the roots and cast a vast ward into the surroundings, releasing the gathered magic and creating a sort of symbiotic relationship. Harry immediately theorized that these trees could serve a similar purpose to the smaller soil fertility and weather moderation wards he planned to create. It struck Harry that if he could show Lord Edwyle the scrolls on magic and the wardstone, he may be able to use it as the segue he'd been looking for to introduce the idea of magic to the man. Surely he'd be receptive if he could see it as a rightful part of his family legacy. As they diligently copied down the rune sequences used on the main wardstone, Harry came to a symbol he knew well. The symbol of the Deathly Hallows had been used here in a rune sequence of some kind. A powerful one judging by its placement near the center of the stone. Stopping to take a closer look, he observed that a small number of the runes in the sequence were Nordic in origin, clearly from his old world. Harry was excited as he knew this could be the key to integrating this new language into some truly powerful rune sequences. They looked fairly basic though, and he could tell much research would be needed before he could combine his wizarding ward schemes with First Men runes. Harry let out his magic to feel the ward emanating from the sequence, intent on divining its purpose. He needn't have tried too hard though, the intent of the ward felt clear to his magic the moment it touched. It kept the dead at bay. Nodding to himself, Harry found he wasn't surprised to find his ancestor had placed such a ward at the center of Winterfell. It was just more evidence of the White Walkers sitting in the north. With a copy of the main wardstone runes, and a slight gift of magics from each of the trio to boost the trickling wards, they apparated home, keeping the details of this wardroom in mind so they could return at a later date if needed. Dobby was happy to have helped Harry uncover more hidden magics. It always filled Harry with such joy. Particularly when Harry found books to steal. It was an odd thing to collect, and if he was honest, Harry seemed almost unhealthily obsessed with hoarding books, but who was Dobby to judge? Dobby would have to keep his eye out for any more hidden caches as they continued their travels. Though really, there wasn't much of interest in those damp underground rooms to interest Dobby. Particularly since Harry had specifically told him not to clean the crypts. According to Harry, underground mazes and graveyards aren't supposed to be in perfect condition. Apparently, it ruins the ambiance, or something like that. Dobby had just sighed and shrugged his shoulders at that point. It didn't make sense to him, but he would just have to trust Harry on this one. Not that it mattered all that much. Dobby had already found a rich treasure room for himself on the first day of his searching. A room filled to the brim with socks of all different shapes and sizes. Now that he'd finished helping Harry, he might as well make a quick visit. Chapter 13 Teaser. Quote, Nella had always seen more than others. She was a dedicated follower of the old gods, and she felt they had gifted her with deeper sight. Some would call it magic, others would call her insane, but she wasn't bothered either way. It never affected her duties. Nella was, however, quite sure she was going dotty. She was sure of it. Not but 5 days ago she saw a child of the forest toddle through the main hall following Lord Edwyle and 2 strangers into his solar like it was any other 7-day. Note: the next chapter is now up for free members on Patreon PanGalacticBard. If you would like to make comments or suggestions on the next draft chapter before it's published, you can head over there and have a look. If you would like to read even further ahead, or simply appreciate the story, I would welcome your donations. 1 comment 0 vote. Don't panic ch13, Family Secrets. Chapter Synopsis. Harry takes Lord Stark down into the crypts to show him the secrets hidden within. Secrets of both their families. Meanwhile, Dobby goes on his own treasure hunt, leaving behind some rather flummoxed locals. Last time, Dobby was happy to have helped Harry uncover more hidden magics. It always filled Harry with such joy. Particularly when Harry found books to steal. Though really, there wasn't much of interest in those damp underground rooms to interest Dobby. Not that it mattered all that much. Dobby had already found a rich treasure room for himself on the first day of his searching. A room filled to the brim with socks of all different shapes and sizes. Now that he'd finished helping Harry, he might as well make a quick visit. Chapter 13, Family Secrets. Nella had always seen more than others. She was a dedicated follower of the old gods, and she felt they had gifted her with deeper sight. Some would call it magic, others would call her insane, but she wasn't bothered either way. It never affected her duties as a lady's maid for Lady Stark. Nella was, however, quite sure she was going dotty. She was certain of it. Not but 5 days ago she saw a child of the forest toddle through the main hall following Lord Edwyle and 2 strangers into his solar like it was any other 7-day. A child of the forest wearing far too many hats, and what looked like socks covering his coat. Then just last night she'd watched the creature and the 2 strangers sneak through the main gate and into the crypts. Though sneaking was a generous definition of their activities, they'd walked through the gate in full sight of the guards, yet no one noticed the intruders, who seemed to shimmer in the torchlight spilling out from the guardhouse. The only concession to being clandestine seemed to be their slightly hunched figures and the middle one jumping clumsily from shadow to shadow like a child playing a poorly constructed game of hopscotch. She watched the exit to the crypts all night, rocking on her chair and slowly darning her lady's old socks. She was darning these socks because an unusual volume of odd pairs seemed to be coming out of the washerwoman's load each day. She did suspect the creature that toddled around with socks darned to his jackets, but she wasn't sure how to raise the subject, still unsure if she was the only one seeing these hallucinations. She finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, still rocking in her chair and wondering if maybe she should ask for a temporary leave of service to visit her sister in White Harbor. Nothing strange ever happened in White Harbor. Dobby walked through the corridors of Winterfell carrying a small sack over his shoulder and whistling happily. He'd just made another visit to the basement sock repository he'd found the other day, and filled his bag with a sample selection, one of each type. Leaving a gold galleon as payment just as each time previously. It was a guilty pleasure, but what was the harm in expanding his collection? It was a little strange that no one was there to take payment, but he was a good upstanding house elf and would never skimp on payment. On his way out, he spotted an older lady's maid dozing off in a rocking chair. He first noticed that the woman seemed to have an active squib magical core. The level of activity that could allow a squib to easily spot wizarding wards, and illusions of all kinds, even enough magic to brew advanced potions with the right ingredients. He'd have to take note of the more powerful squibs he found. He was sure Harry would want to know. Just as he was about to pass by, he noticed another pair of socks strewn on the floor, these ones a stunning shade of green. Falling to temptation, he carefully deposited one of them into his sack, and replaced it with another gold galleon before merrily continuing on his way. Just 2 days after their foray into the crypts, Harry had found a suitable book in which he could slip a hint that would point Lord Edwyle in the right direction. That book being the journal of the last King of Winter. Likely the one who hid their treasures in the first place. Harry tucked the journal in his shirt and made his way out of the library, leaving the maester to his tasks. Harry was cautious of the maester when it came to revealing magic. He'd been friendly and helpful so far, and more than willing to at least consider Harry's various suggestions for improvement of their lands and production, but Harry did note the conspicuous lack of any records even hinting at magic in his library domain. Harry was sure a library of this age should have at least a few records tucked away on one shelf or another. Maybe a prior maester of Winterfell was to blame. With that in mind, Harry made his way to Lord Edwyle's solar, asking a waiting servant to seek permission to see the Lord at short notice. In Lord Edwyle's solar, Harry sat down, ready to share his wondrous find with his Stark kin. After the usual greetings, Harry began, "This is actually a bit of a sensitive matter," he said, getting Edwyle's attention. "I felt I should bring your attention to this journal I found tucked behind some other books, hidden deep in the back of your library. I feel that if you knew of it, the book wouldn't have been there to begin with." Lord Edwyle mumbled, noncommittedly, not entirely sure what this would really be about, but figuring he'd let it play out. "The book." Harry held the journal out for Lord Edwyle, who looked it over with curiosity and flicked through a few pages. "This," Lord Edwyle began, but paused seemingly to double-check. "This is the journal of the last King of Winter, Torrhen Stark." Lord Edwyle was incredulous, and they both sat in silence for a moment, as he continued flicking through the pages, and absorbed the importance of this find. Harry broke the silence. "Of course, it has great value to the Stark line, and is a great find in and of itself, but to get the most value out of it, I'd like you to open it to the page I've bookmarked." "This," Harry said, pointing to the page, "is an account of how King Torrhen and his most trusted man, Lord Reed, hid the Stark treasury and royal artifacts in the crypts to keep their wealth away from the invading Targaryens." Lord Edwyle's eyes widened, and he leaned in to examine the journal more closely. After a moment, he looked up at Harry and nodded in agreement. "This is an incredible find. I know of no mentions of Stark lords recovering such a treasury, and we certainly know the Winter Throne and Crown to be lost to time, though they're mentioned here in the journal," Lord Edwyle replied contemplatively. Reviewing the passage again, he slowly stood. "We must be cautious in this," he said. "We cannot risk the wrong people learning of this if it truly exists." Walking to the door with purpose, gripping the journal tightly, he continued, "Since you already know though, and were forthright enough to bring this to my attention, I would appreciate your help in searching for this hidden room. More hands make light work after all. Return this evening, just after sunset. We'll go down into the crypts to quietly investigate. Speak of this to no one," he instructed as they parted ways. Harry was pleased with that result. This was exactly the scenario he needed to both ingratiate himself with his kin, the Starks, and to hopefully introduce magic with little interference from others. Later that evening, Harry quietly met by the crypt entrance with Lord Edwyle, and Esser Castle, the Lord's most trusted sworn sword, to seek out the hidden chamber. With flaming torches in hand, the trio ventured into the crypts. Harry made sure they stumbled around in their search, not wanting to reveal that he already knew the chamber's location. He subtly guided them towards the hidden wall, making sure they noticed that the smoke from their torches seemed to flow through cracks in the wall, hinting at a concealed space. As they reviewed the wall in front of them, Lord Edwyle searched for a lever or some handle, pressing against the wall and trying various methods to uncover an entrance. In the process, he fortuitously cut his hand on a sharp stone. His Stark blood spilled onto the wall, and a deep rumbling echoed through the crypt as the wall began to sink into the floor, revealing the hidden chamber behind. As Lord Edwyle looked over the gathered horde in front of him in astonishment, he couldn't help but feel that luck was on their side, and quietly gave thanks to the old gods for their grace. Glancing to the center, he stood in awe of the throne, sitting in silent watch over the treasury, a throne that, if not for the dragons, he would sit upon as king. He sighed at that fruitless thought and turned to the bountiful plies of gold coins. It was no Lannister gold hoard, in fact he was sure it was fairly modest compared to many of the great houses. It was likely just a portion of the kingdom's treasury at the time they bent the knee. It would have been suspicious to the conquering Targaryens if Torrhen Stark had hidden the entire treasury. The piles were, however, a mite larger than the gold piles he would usually have gathered together in preparation for the start of winter. This was quite the boon. With winter having just passed, the Stark treasury was largely depleted. He thought, with a smile, that this gold could drive a far stronger start to the usual frenzy of summer building activities. He'd be able to afford more seed for planting, with plenty of gold left over to set aside for much-needed infrastructure projects. He suspected many of the suggestions from Harry and Maester Garrick could be funded with this gold. It was like a weight lifted off his shoulders. He felt lighter than he had all winter. He thanked the old gods for this trio of wandering foreign nobles masquerading as merchants. That they decided to visit Winterfell was a blessing, one he could never have seen coming, but was very grateful for nonetheless. As they delved into the hidden chamber, Harry directed Lord Edwyle and Esser Castle's attention towards the scrolls at the back. He picked up one of them, feigning interest while knowing that it contained instructions on Stark magics and a small map to the wardstone hidden deeper in the crypt. While Harry pretended to examine the rest of the chamber's contents, Lord Edwyle studied the writings on the scroll. His eyebrows rose higher and higher as he read about the ancient magics mentioned within. Although skeptical, he couldn't help but feel curious. He hadn't mentioned it, but it hadn't passed his notice that the wall blocking their entrance to this chamber seemed to move as if by some magic, and it seemed to activate only when his blood came in contact. Never let it be said he was unobservant. After considering his companions on this expedition, he chose to trust them, and showed Harry and Esser Castle the map he'd found. They agreed that now was as good a time as any to investigate, and set off deeper into the maze of crypts, leaving the gold and artifacts to be moved later. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper into the labyrinthine passages, the torchlight casting eerie shadows on the dusty walls adorned with cobwebs. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the countless Stark ancestors buried within, their stone likenesses watching the trio with silent, solemn gazes. Edwyle had never been this deep, even when he played in here as a child. He was momentarily nostalgic over that particular past time. His mother had been most displeased with his activities, and the punishment certainly taught him to keep away. As a parent, he understood that his mother had most likely just been concerned about the tunnels collapsing. In fact, they were quite lucky that all the partial collapses they'd passed so far had enough space in them for a full-grown man to pass through. Finally, they arrived at what was clearly the entrance to a second chamber. He didn't need the map anymore, he could immediately tell it was an entrance. It was hidden more by its deeper location in the crypt maze than by any other method. Edwyle was distracted from his perusal of the archway and wall that likely hid the second chamber by a gesture from Harry. "Look, here, at the base of this statue," Harry said as he pointed to the ancient statue of a lady standing guard to the left of the door. "This is the symbol of my house, the Peverell crest." Sure enough, Edwyle could make out the slightly worn symbol carved into the base of the statue, clearly matching the Peverell coat of arms. Stunned, Edwyle took a step back and took in the two statues bordering the archway. "These have to be the first Starks," Edwyle said with a whispered reverence, "Bran the Builder and his wife, Lady Iolanthe Peverell. I never thought I'd see their likeness. It is incredible to see tangible evidence of our link to the Age of Heroes. Of course, if we were to find it anywhere, it would be here in the base of the crypts." Turning towards the lady's statue on the left, Stark figured it was as good a time as any to fill Harry in on what he knew of the Starks' connection to the Peverells. "I have to say, I was surprised when you came to Winterfell claiming the name of Peverell. It's not a well-known name outside the North, as it hasn't been heard of in Westeros since the Age of Heroes. As far as we knew, Iolanthe was the last Peverell, and married Bran to start the Stark line. I had heard of Iolanthe before, but didn't see the appropriate time to bring it up. Harry said in response, "I believe we are linked through her father, Ignotus, who was a common ancestor to both of us. From the legends I had heard north of the Wall, Ignotus was a key contributor to the war against the others in the Long Night, and helped Bran build his wall. Certainly a powerful pair to start a powerful line," Harry concluded, turning to Edwyle. Edwyle smiled brightly at the compliment to his family line, but raised an eyebrow at the mention of learning things north of the Wall. It took but a moment for a few dots to connect in his mind, and he realized that Harry, Sirius and Dobby must, in fact, have been the hapless merchants he'd been told about by the Night's Watch. The ones that had, accidentally, ended up on the wrong side of the biggest, most obvious landmark in all of No history. He filed that observation away. He'd definitely need to get that story from Harry at a later date. Though knowing Harry, he now suspected that their adventures might have been a bit more deliberate than they'd indicated to the prickly Night's Watch. Probably a bit of wanderlust, they were on a self-ordained exploration of the world after all. Breaking from his momentary distraction, Lord Edwyle gave Harry a friendly smile. "You may not hold the Stark name Harry, but as the founders of our ancient house, the Peverell name holds a special place in the hearts of the Starks. Know that you will always be welcome in Winterfell. Not least for all the good you've already done here." Edwyle offered his arm to Harry in a brotherly greeting. "I won't say no to that," Harry agreed, grabbing Edwyle's hand. "It seems both the Starks and Peverells have been whittled down to only a few members over the years, so I will not say no to more family, no matter how distant." This had gone a lot better than Harry had thought. He should show his distant relatives long-hidden treasure troves more often. Not like he was overloaded with family to spoil after all. Esser Castle observed all this quietly, but also had a small smile for his friend, Lord Edwyle, finding new family. "That being said, we should get back to the matter at hand," Harry said, gesturing back to the wall, breaking the trio from the distraction posed by the statues. "Try cutting your hand and placing it on the wall like you did with the other chamber." "Yes, of course, let's get to it. I was just so shocked to see the founders of my house. But now I'm curious to know what they're guarding." Following Harry's instructions, with only slight hesitation, the wall was soon sinking into the floor with a rumble. Harry's two companions on this adventure let out twin gasps at the sight that met them on the other side. As Harry had observed on his first visit, the wardstone was entwined with weirwood roots, feeding off its magic. Occasionally a dim blue light ran down a root like some sort of mysterious magical pulse. The sight was both inspiring and eerie, a testament to the ancient power that once thrived in the north. As Lord Edwyle approached the wardstone, he couldn't help but feel a strange sensation, as if an invisible force was emanating from the stone, making the air around it hum with energy. He glanced at Harry and Esser Castle, who seemed to feel it as well. Harry seized the opportunity to suggest that this was a live example of some of the magics he'd just read about in the scroll. He theorized further, suggesting that this sensation is reminiscent of other obscure magics I've encountered during my travels. I probably have more experience with such magics than most, and would be happy to help you investigate and learn more. I can start with understanding the purpose of this wardstone and the power it holds, in secret of course." He took a breath, having made an effort to get the whole pitch out before either of his companions could get out any sort of skeptical response. Harry needn't have worried. Lord Edwyle might previously have been skeptical, but he'd grown up on the old tales, and had more reason now than ever before to believe there was something to those myths. He supposed the recent reminder of their somewhat tenuous family connection might help with a bit of that trust as well. Esser Castle, ever loyal, followed his lord and friend's lead, showing far more curiosity than skepticism. Harry felt a sense of relief and satisfaction that he had successfully introduced the concept of real magic still existing to Lord Stark and his trusted man. That they seemed to be handling the news well was the best outcome he could ask for. If he could build on this acceptance of magic, Harry might eventually be able to open up a few more possibilities for the Starks, and the impact it could have on the North were immense. If need be, he'd associate any unexplained happenings by blaming it on the magics of this wardstone. It was helpful that, to Lord Edwyle, the wardstone was a mysterious ancient tool of unknown purpose. He had no way of knowing its ultimate purpose of keeping the dead at bay. Later that night, having agreed that the artifacts of this treasury would remain hidden, while Esser Castle would slowly siphon the gold into the main Stark treasury over the next few moons, they made their way back to the surface. As they moved through the crypts one last time, Harry made one more gambit at getting magic integrated into his uplift plans. Lord Edwyle, before we part, I think I can offer a bit more help with our plans, though this will have to stay between us to maintain the secrecy of these magics. Lord Edwyle nodded for Harry to continue, focusing on the path ahead in the dim torchlight. I know of people on foreign lands who used to plant smaller runic wardstones, much like the one we saw tonight, to enrich the fertility of the lands they serve. I would theorize that we could do much the same to a far greater effect with the help of the weirwood trees, as we've just seen today. I suspect they have some sort of a connection and possible boosting affect to the wardstone. I will need to investigate the weirwoods in more detail, but I'm confident that with a little trial and error I can translate these runes and prepare a few small wardstones to plant on your farmlands. We might even be able to moderate the weather slightly. As Harry shared his thoughts, Lord Edwyle slowly drew to a halt, pausing to listen more intently to a plan that, if offered before tonight, would have seen Harry thrown out as a lunatic. Now, however, he trusted this could work. He was also shrewd enough to suspect that Harry was leading him along a path of discovery that he already had some insight into. He could respect that Harry was gently nudging him towards something that he never would have believed beforehand. Interestingly, he wasn't even remotely concerned or distrustful of Harry's motives. Both his gut and his observations told him that Harry was an honest man. Lord Edwyle agreed almost immediately, and declared that Harry would be paid for this research, even if it didn't pan out. Harry of course tried to refuse the money, but Lord Edwyle wouldn't hear of it. If they succeeded, this could be game-changing for his crop yields, and maybe someday he could quietly deploy such measures throughout the north, reducing their dependence on the south. His eyes twinkled at that thought. Between these fertility wardstones, and the notes he'd already seen from Maester Garrick on the benefits of Harry's crop rotation method, they might actually be approaching a solution to the North's greatest hurdle, that being feeding the population. Feeling the evening to be both a great adventure, and an even greater success, they each parted ways to their beds, ruminating on the opportunities that would arise from these finds. Harry was over the moon with his successes in secretly introducing the Starks to magic and the boons he could offer. Of course, he'd be leveraging his own home world's runes primarily, but Lord Stark didn't need to know that, and these people deserved the boons he could grant them, especially with such little effort. Chapter 14 Teaser. The whole thing seemed to focus on a knot of people surrounding the central weirwood tree, upon which they had tied what looked from a distance to be a child of the forest wearing Master Padrick's horrid hat and gold rings. They'd covered the creature from head to toe in the tree's red sap, and some were chanting an old tongue lyric to ward away evil spirits. Nella was speechless. What on earth was going on? Note: the next chapter is now up for free members on Patreon PanGalacticBard. If you would like to make comments or suggestions on the next draft chapter before it's published, you can head over there and have a look. If you would like to read even further ahead, or simply appreciate the story, I would welcome your donations. 0 comments 0 vote. Don't panic. Ch14. Back to the grindstone. Chapter synopsis. A bit of medieval tech uplift, and a solid dose of petty revenge. All the makings of a productive Winterfell stopover. Last time, as Lord Edwyle looked over the gathered horde in front of him in astonishment, he couldn't help but feel that luck was on their side, and quietly gave thanks to the old gods for their grace. It was no Lannister gold hoard. In fact, he was sure it was fairly modest compared to many of the great houses. It was likely just a portion of the kingdom's treasury at the time they bent the knee. It would have been suspicious to the conquering Targaryens if Torrhen Stark had hidden the entire treasury. The piles were, however, a mite larger than the gold piles he would usually have gathered together in preparation for the start of winter. This was quite the boon. With winter having just passed, the Stark treasury was largely depleted. He thought, with a smile, that this gold could drive a far stronger start to the usual frenzy of summer building activities. He'd be able to afford more seed for planting, with plenty of gold left over to set aside for much-needed infrastructure projects. He suspected many of the suggestions from Harry and Maester Garrick could be funded with this gold. It was like a weight lifted off his shoulders. He felt lighter than he had all winter. Chapter 14. Back to the grindstone. Despite wanting to spend more time on the first men's scrolls they had recovered from the crypts, Harry had made a commitment to Lord Stark to offer valuable knowledge that could help his kingdom. Each night, after a day with the Maester, Harry would delve further into his own tent library, focusing on the history section to gather ideas on low-tech improvements he could introduce to this medieval world. It was all quite mentally exhausting, but it would be well worth it for the quality of life improvement he knew could be achieved for the small folk of these lands. Ultimately, he'd only be sharing a small number of the ideas he'd collated, with the most impactful being the mills and crop rotation. Most of the other concepts were focused around taking advantage of those innovations. Though Sirius occasionally chipped in with his own thoughts, like cheap animal fat soaps he'd noticed were worryingly absent in this world. He felt, this evening, that he was thankfully reaching the finish line in terms of how many new ideas the small folk could reasonably be expected to stomach in such a short time, even under orders from their lord to implement them. Change could be a dangerous thing after all, and Harry had no intention of creating unrest. Having shared Sirius's soap-making idea with Maester Garrick, he turned his attention to one final concept, that of introducing Roman road-building methods to Westeros. He knew that true productivity and prosperity would come from open trade facilitated by faster, easier trade routes. After all, the Romans controlled a vast empire with their improvements to trade and travel through their roads. After the Romans fell, the Venetians, Dutch, Portuguese, and then the English built their own global empires, each taking over from the other as they developed better seagoing vessels, roads, and eventually rails to dominate the trade routes. Forget wars, trade ultimately built these empires. Harry had no interest in an industrial revolution, so rail was off the cards, but roads, rivers, canals and sea routes all offered room for improvement. He'd yet to see any canals in the north, but noted that the river system was vast. He scratched down a note to look into that later. Harry had already begun considering the benefit of starting his own trading company for these reasons. For the northerners he would start with roads. As he researched, Harry confirmed his vague recollection that Roman roads were remarkably long-lasting and hard-wearing, even in extreme climates. After all, the Roman road network extended all the way from the frosty moors of Scotland down to the sandy dunes of the Sahara Desert. Harry could easily see the same building techniques working in the north or even in the drier lands he'd read about in Dorne. Roman roads were designed with a keen eye for efficiency and durability, which contributed to their success in connecting their vast empire. Though they would require some level of engineering oversight, and he wasn't sure such knowledge existed in the north. Thinking of the towering walls around Winterfell, Harry figured they must have some kind of specialist skills in building with stone in the north. Though, despite the absurd size of the castle, it was ultimately just a pile of loose stone carved and stacked together with some wooden support beams. Similar to the medieval castles that dotted Europe, northern construction seemed to lack the nuanced complexity seen in the soaring domes of Roman palaces, or the strength and utility of Roman cement constructs. Harry recalled that even with all the examples of Roman domes still standing in Europe, it took 700 years after the fall of Rome for medieval engineers to regain the skills for making them. At least building roads wouldn't be too much of a step outside the comfort zone for northern builders. Nonetheless, he would leave instructions to give them a good starting point, and allow the maester to train some small folk in the additional skills they needed. He dropped any of the more complex skills and focused on methods of surveying and planning in his instructions. It didn't escape Harry that the few tracks that were more than mud were still exceedingly winding and rambling. No real engineering seemed to be involved in their roads to date. He'd heard that the King's Road might have been a proper engineered construction, which was reflected in its fairly direct route on the maps, but those he spoke to in the taverns seemed to think it was still a mess of mud for the most part, just straighter and wider. Unlike the winding tracks they'd encountered here in Westeros so far, Roman roads were known for their straight and direct routes, designed to ensure the shortest and most efficient travel between destinations. This naturally helped travelers save both time and effort, making trade and communication across vast distances more feasible. Leaving the notes on surveying and route planning to the side, Harry looked into the construction methods. As he recalled, the Romans employed a multi-layered structure that contributed to their longevity, which was a must in a world with no real concept of road maintenance. The base layer consisted of large stones, followed by a layer of smaller stones or gravel. Above that was a layer of compacted sand or fine gravel, and finally, the top layer was composed of large, tightly fitted paving stones. Thankfully, all of these materials could be found throughout the north, which meant any construction crews Lord Stark sent out wouldn't have to lug rocks and other heavy materials with them, they could forage in situ. Proper drainage was also crucial to the roads' durability and formed a whole page of Harry's notes. The lack of drainage further explained why many of the tracks they'd found were almost impossible to follow after the winter snow. Many were just mud pits pretending to be a road. To accommodate drainage, these new roads would have to be built with a slight tilt, or camber, allowing water to run off the surface and into ditches on either side. This would ensure the roads remained usable even in wet conditions, preventing them from becoming waterlogged. Finally, Harry added a proposal for Stark-sponsored waystations and inns along major routes, to offer rest stops, food, and shelter to weary travelers. Despite traveling most of the north, the trio hadn't spotted any inns or guard posts along the roads between towns in the north, and the distances between towns were often too vast to cover in a day, even flying. Travelers seemed to accept that camping by the roadside was a necessity. Harry had initially sent Sirius out to ask the locals about the lack of inns along the routes, thinking they may have just missed them somehow. It was a quite exasperated Sirius that had subsequently informed him, "There's apparently only one such inn on the whole continent, and it's apparently so well known that it's simply referred to as the Crossroads Inn." "Really?" Harry asked in resignation, "the Crossroads Inn? Did they only have the one inn, or the one crossroads?" "Actually, I've decided I don't even want to know." Harry just shook his head and jotted down some more notes for the maester, mumbling under his breath about primitive economies and medieval sensibilities. The waystations would bring in a much-needed boost to trade, while also allowing for better policing of the land. They would support the surrounding small folk, and movement of information and goods. With all of the benefits, Roman roads seemed like a no-brainer, but Harry could see this would be the hardest project to pitch. The cost of such a project would be immediately prohibitive. Nonetheless, he'd push hard to get Lord Stark on board, if only due to the guaranteed lift in trade and economic prosperity it would deliver for the region. Maybe he'd encourage them to start on a road to their biggest port first. With that final note, Harry struck a line under his last page, signed it, and rolled the parchments up, letting out a sigh of relief. Harry felt no qualms in giving such tech advantages to the northern kingdom above the other kingdoms in Westeros. While he hadn't yet ventured to the south, he had already started to feel a kinship with the people of the north. From the stories of the then and those he and Sirius had heard so far in the north, he also concluded that the north was the closest in culture to the Thens, and most likely to accept those of magical heritage. Harry wasn't yet ready to consider settling down anywhere, but strong allies in the north would always be a boon to Harry and the Then, wherever they ended up. With a sense of satisfaction, Harry called Dobby to send the parchments up to Maester Garrick's desk in the castle, knowing the good maester was more of a morning person, and would read through them all before he made his way up the next morning. The tent library had become a cozy and growing sanctuary for Harry and Sirius. Surrounded by shelves filled with books on various subjects, they had transformed the space into a haven of knowledge and comfort. Soft rugs covered the floor, while plush armchairs and a small table occupied the center of the room. A magical, ever-burning hearth provided warmth and a soft, flickering light that cast a gentle glow over the pages of the books and scrolls they studied. Sirius looked up from the dry material on Roman road construction that Harry had roped him into helping with, his thoughts starting to drift. Racking his brain for something, anything that might be more interesting to occupy his time, Sirius' mind turned to that fellow Padrick. The smarmy master of the market that had just been asking to be pranked. Knowing how short of food they were in northern winters, the pudgy nature of this fellow, who was clearly skimming from the top, just rubbed him the wrong way. The man simply reeked of all sorts of minor corruptions. Actions that likely left others to suffer just that bit more during winter. He smirked at the thought. Sirius was a self-proclaimed pro at petty revenge, and here was a deserving target. Shooting one last glare at the book that had been slowly torturing him with boredom over the last 2 hours, 10 exceedingly mundane facts about road construction you never thought you'd need to know, he picked it up and threw it back into the waiting pile. With a stretch and a wide yawn, he hopped up and made his way to the magic section in search of inspiration. After a few false starts, Sirius found exactly what he needed in a book on illusions. This spell would cause the target to look like a house elf, to all parties bar themselves. In fact, it had a bit of a similar effect to the amulet they'd made for Dobby, but it would be temporary. The original spell was created by a pureblood as a form of deep insult, but Sirius felt it would be suitable here in making people think the master was one of the mythical children of the forest. Which of course he would vehemently deny, creating exactly the type of confusion and chaos Sirius preferred. Sirius mumbled to himself, scratching his chin in thought. Surely Harry wouldn't be too worried about the blatant use of magic in the prank if it could be mistaken for one of the North's existing legends. It's not like anyone would link it back to us anyway. Thinking he could make this a bit of a longer-term deterrent, Sirius also pulled down a book on magical contracts. If he could get the master to sign a contract, he could use it as an anchor for the spell effect, causing it to reoccur whenever a term of the contract was broken. He'd just need to set the terms to say something along the lines of, the signee will refrain from overcharging merchants, and every time the term is breached, he'll know it, and that self-knowledge will trigger the contract, until such time as the contract is destroyed or no longer gathers enough ambient magic to operate. The Marauders had done something similar to Ethel Pruitt in Ravenclaw when they'd learned she had a habit of stealing supplies from first years. With the help of the contract, the spell would re-trigger every time she knowingly stole again. It was a simple case of adding the terms in between some boring and innocuous legal jargon on a contract they prepared for anyone ordering honeydukes from the Marauders. This wasn't even hard to arrange, because all the students knew the Marauders ran a small sweets and goods acquisition service for a price, which they ran in between Hogsmeade weekends when students had no easy access to town. The following day, Sirius woke with a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent most of the night researching magical contracts and refining his plan for the prank. Though he had lost himself much deeper in the research than he had initially intended when it occurred to him that they could probably use these contracts to their advantage throughout Westeros. It would be much easier to rely on automatically enforced contracts than to just blindly place their trust in the wide range of people they would inevitably engage with in their travels. Even just maintaining secrecy about a topic could be enforced through agreement in the contract, preventing loose tongues. Sirius put that research to the side for future reference. He was sure it would come in handy. After getting Harry on board with this bit of mischief over breakfast, Sirius set about getting his scheme in motion. Harry simply gave him the gimlet eye and moved off to the castle to meet with the maester for something or other. He was such a nerd sometimes, but Sirius loved him like a son nonetheless. Sirius made his way into the marketplace, where he knew he would find the rotund, smarmy master of the market. The man was always there, keeping a sharp eye on his numerous ventures and ensuring his pockets were well-lined. Though Sirius did note he looked a bit more disheveled than the last time they spoke. Sirius considered it might be the result of the master misplacing the 10 leprechaun gold coins Sirius had paid him previously, wishing he'd been there to see the result in person. As Sirius approached the master, he put on his convincing facade of a simple, bumbling merchant, seeking advice from a more experienced professional. Sirius not so quietly mumbled to himself about having discovered a source of gold in his travels further north, while stretching his head and mumbling further that he needed to figure out what to do with this information. All this hapless mumbling was done well within hearing distance of the master, knowing full well that the man's greed would see him insist on being brought in on this find. Having been quickly accosted by the master, and taken to a quiet tavern, Sirius spun a tale of vast profits from this hypothetical gold mine. Sirius allowed the master to nudge and push his way into a joint partnership. This gave him the perfect excuse to bring out the parchment contract, explaining that it would ensure their partnership remained exclusive and that any shared knowledge would be protected. The contract was simple, and the clause he needed wasn't even all that hidden. It simply stated that the signee would not knowingly commit any criminal act until the partnership expired, in 2 moons or until the gold is found, whichever period is shorter. Sirius didn't want this prank to go on too long. Sirius had of course written the penalty clause in invisible ink, linking it to the charm that would illusion Padrick as a house elf for a good few hours after every breach. Such a trick would be impossible in the wizarding world, where no self-respecting wizard would ever sign a serious contract not written on goblin parchment, which would burn away invisible ink, and would glow red at any sign of trickery in the terms. How the goblins detected such things was beyond any wizard's understanding, just as the goblins liked it. Eager to secure the supposed profits, and thinking that he could ignore the contract either way, Master Padrick hastily signed the contract. Sirius was honestly impressed that he could even read, but he supposed that's how he got the job in the first place. Sirius concealed his glee at a prank well executed, shook the man's hand, and wandered off, thinking he'd spend the rest of the day working on his DIY broom. It now reached 5 feet off the ground, which he was rather chuffed with. Over the next few days, whispers began to spread that Master Padrick was actually a mischievous child of the forest in disguise. It honestly wasn't a glowing endorsement of children of the forest, because Master Padrick was a bit of a dick, but it did seem to fit in with the tales their old folk told of magic being a double-edged sword. Not all magic beings would necessarily be friendly. Some of the elders did have a few suggestions on how to purge Master Padrick of evil, and hopefully return him to the shape of a man. Whether they were serious suggestions, or just sarcastic comments by previously burnt clientele of the good master, no one was sure, but most of the locals were willing to try their suggestions either way. Nella hadn't heard any of the whispers in the town about Master Padrick. She had been far too busy over the last few days, squirreled away in the castle desperately darning new pairs of socks for her lady. She never did find the old ones, but she would be a monkey's uncle before she let her lady go out with an odd pair of socks. She was therefore very much surprised when she walked down to the town to fetch more yarn, only to find most of the townsfolk congregating in the Godswood, with some sort of small festival underway. The whole thing seemed to focus on a knot of people surrounding the central weirwood tree, upon which they had tied what looked from a distance to be a child of the forest wearing Master Padrick's horrid hat and gold rings. They'd covered the creature from head to toe in the tree's red sap, and some were chanting an old tongue lyric to ward away evil spirits. Nella was speechless. What on earth was going on? There was no festival scheduled until the harvest. Following some frantic whispered questions to her kin and friends who all seemed to be in on this weird event, she was informed that they weren't honestly sure what to do about Master Padrick. But they all agreed this was probably a good start. Nella looked to the child wearing Padrick's clothes, then back to her friends, and simply gave them a deadpan look. She knew that somehow her friends were involved in this suggestion. They'd all wanted to tie the man to a tree at some point, or worse, it just seems they'd suddenly found a reason. That the master was actually a child of the forest was a whole other rabbit hole she wasn't sure she wanted to go down. Though there was a lack of agreement on this. Some thought the master had been kidnapped, and that this event was to get the being to confess and return the master, though most didn't seem too keen on him being returned, they were just having fun with the process. Others thought Master Padrick was shape-shifted by a wood switch as punishment for his corruption, and that this was an event to cleanse his corruption. Either way, they were all having lots of fun, so they generally agreed that everything was fine, and all agreed that tying him to a weirwood could only be an improvement to his snappy and slimy character. There were surprisingly few dissenters to this plan, and that's how this whole impromptu little festival started. Nella now knew exactly what was going on, and yet somehow felt like she knew less than when she'd started, and certainly wished she hadn't asked. Though she could understand the festive atmosphere, many townsfolk were still in high spirits due to the cheap fresh foods brought by those merchants, so she understood how even the first mention of a small cleansing ceremony quickly cascaded into the town festival Nella found before her. Little local stalls had set up between small fire pits and children were dancing to some new songs about the coming sun and the hungry wolf. The place was definitely going insane, but Nella smiled anyway. It was nice to see so much happiness. Well, Master Padrick didn't seem too happy, but that didn't bother her. She just hoped Lord Stark didn't hear of this insanity. Handing over some coppers to a food vendor, she happily nibbled on something foreign called a potato jacket. She also saw a small shrine of flowers set up by the second largest weirwood, along with a single flickering candle on a pedestal. Next to all this stood a hawker that looked a lot like the maid from the tavern in town, offering a dragon for any who could extinguish the divine flame of the old gods. Nella shook her head and decided she could do without buying yarn today. Instead she'd head back up the hill to the relative sanity of the castle. Chapter 15 Teaser. Harry stepped into the ring in the middle of the training yard, his muscles warming up as he ran through a few of his sword forms and footing exercises. He had donned the boiled leather armor they had put together for him, and held the sword of Gryffindor, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. Sirius, on the other hand, walked into the yard swinging the training sword they had loaned him with little form but a lot of confidence. He seemed to be more focused on putting on a show than preparing for the upcoming matches. Note: the next chapter is now up for free members on Patreon PanGalacticBard. If you would like to make comments or suggestions on the next draft chapter before it's published, you can head over there and have a look. If you would like to read even further ahead, or simply appreciate the story, I would welcome your donations. 0 comments 0 vote. Don't panic CH15, into the training yard. Chapter Synopsis. Harry and Sirius finally show their faces in the training yard, ready to give this medieval sword-swinging thing a try. Though only one of them was trained in the use of a blade by the goblins. Last time, Lord Edwyle gave Harry a friendly smile. You may not hold the Stark name Harry, but as the founders of our ancient house, the Peverell name holds a special place in the hearts of the Starks. Know that you will always be welcome in Winterfell. Not least for all the good you've already done here. Chapter 15. Into the training yard. On one of the warmer days, with the sun finally shining in a mostly cloudless sky, Harry and Sirius, feeling the need to take a break from their various projects, decided that a little exercise would be good to get their blood pumping. And what better activity in the medieval world than a bit of sword swinging in the training yard? The idea of it actually had Harry a little giddy. Harry had trained hard under the tutelage of master goblin warriors, and was keen to test his own skills against those of the medieval swordsmen of Westeros. Harry was sure he would make a good showing in the training yard, and that wasn't even counting the powerful strength and agility charms he'd learned from the Black Library family magics. He doubted he'd need to apply any of those charms in the yard today, but he should find some time to practice those as well. He might be getting a bit rusty. Harry smirked to himself. Of course, he hadn't informed Sirius of his skills with the blade yet. The last time Sirius knew him, he was a hapless 15-year-old. Sirius had some dueling training from his childhood under tutors hired by the Black family and, in his usual way, Sirius was very confident in his abilities. He was frankly strutting as they made their way down to the training yard, hearing the clank of blunted steel on steel from a few already going through their afternoon training routines. As they approached the training yard, Harry couldn't help but smile at Sirius's enthusiasm. He admired his godfather's confidence and eagerness to learn, even after all these years. It was a testament to their resilience and adaptability in this strange new world. Upon reaching the yard, Harry spotted Esser Castle, the master-at-arms, overseeing the training of several guardsmen. "Ho there, Esser Castle," Harry greeted from halfway across the yard. "Mind if we join?" he queried, getting the attention of most in the yard. Harry trotted over to the older man, smiling ear to ear at the rather taken-aback look on Esser Castle's face. Harry concluded that Esser Castle had written him off as a curiosity but non-threat. The type of lordling that's overly educated by maesters, and undereducated by the fighters of the household. "I hope you don't mind," Harry started again, getting the knight's attention back to reality. "It's been too long, and we're both keen to brush the rust off our sword forms. You never know what we'll encounter on the road." Looking around at the guardsmen in the yard, Harry continued, "And I'd love to test myself against some of the North's finest," knowing that such a compliment would be well received, even if it might be a bit of an overstatement. Harry saw a few chests puff up at that comment. Esser Castle shook himself a bit and finally responded, "You're merchants, aren't you?" he inquired gruffly. "And minor foreign nobles, if what I've heard is correct." He was obviously asking this loudly for the benefit of the guardsmen, as Esser Castle knew them full well, having accompanied them on the still-secret discovery of the Winterfell treasure in Wardstone. Harry understood that Esser Castle probably wanted the guardsmen to know their standing, and not write them off as passing, uppity merchants. "Aye, that's us," Sirius replied, already looking over the blunted swords in on the racks. "Can we borrow these? Our own swords are obviously too sharp for a training bout," he added. Esser Castle nodded. "Ah, yay, that and some protective gear. We wouldn't want you injured. A friend of Lord Stark is always welcome in the training yard, but are you sure you're up for it?" He'd added the friend comment to further establish their position for the benefit of the guards. Sirius replied confidently, his chest puffing out a bit. "We're quite skilled in the art of swordplay, I assure you." Determined to be less flowery in his response, Harry took on a more solemn tone for effect. "I'll not comment on my own ability," he said, "I'll let you find out in the ring. Actions speak louder than words." A few of the guards seemed to like this comment, grunting in response or in challenge to what were obviously fighting words. Esser Castle raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Well, if you're as capable as you claim, I'll be happy to go around with you myself. I'm curious to see what foreign nobles can do." That got a few whistles and cheers. Everyone seemed keen to see something new, especially since they were the first real visitors since winter ended. Things got a bit stale when the guardsmen only had each other to train with over the winter, and even fewer bandits to fight in the field. Harry simply grinned. This would be fun. While they waited for Esser Castle to arrange the protective gear, mainly some greaves and a chest plate, Harry took the opportunity to observe the guardsmen around them. The men moved with fairly good precision and skill, clearly well-trained and disciplined, though he got the impression their stamina could use a little work. Harry suspected the concept of endurance exercise was not really established, nor was weightlifting or muscle mass. They did however have a clear and strong focus on accuracy in sword form, so he couldn't really fault them. He found himself silently admiring their techniques, hoping to glean some new insights that he could apply to his own fighting style, which was clearly quite different. Harry noticed Esser Castle send a page boy scurrying off, no doubt to inform interested parties about the spectacle unfolding in the yard. He glanced at Sirius, who seemed entirely unconcerned. Sure enough, it wasn't long before Lord Edwyle and Maester Garrick made their way to the training yard, eager to see the merchants turn swordsmen in action. Harry felt a twinge of apprehension as he caught the Lord Edwyle's scrutinizing gaze, but it faded quickly. He had no reason to be concerned. His skill was nothing to scoff at, even if he'd been rather lax in training during his time in Westeros. Harry unsheathed his blade and took a few swings, deciding to begin warming up with his own blade while he waited for Esser Castle to sort out their training equipment. He got a bit of attention when he drew the sword of Gryffindor from his hip. He had taken to carrying it with him everywhere, but it was quite flashy sword, so he had a mild notice me not cast on the scabbard. The blade itself received many appreciative and covetous looks from others in the yard now that it was clearly on display. Harry could understand why, of course. It was a beautiful blade, possibly one of the greatest achievements of goblin forging in his old world. The blade was currently in the form of a longsword, the longsword being Harry's preferred blade, though the sword itself could change according to the user's will. The handle and crossguard glinted in the light of the sun, shining gold for all to see, and on the pommel sat a ruby large enough that it could easily sit in pride of place on a king's crown. The blade itself shone silver, but was much stronger than the color of the metal would suggest, having been forged from near impregnable goblin silver. Harry was sure the blade was stronger than anything this world could throw at it, and sharp enough to carve a rock in two like it was butter. No armor would stand up to this blade. The goblins had been impressed with the addition of basilisk venom to the blade and the tale Harry told of his battle against the basilisk. In recognition of this great feat, the goblins had carved his name on one side of the blade, to join the engraved name of Gryffindor on the other. Harry himself was quite proud to have been considered worth of being named beside Gryffindor, and was happy to notice that whatever magic the goblins had carved into the sword had caused the engraving to change to Peverell when he entered this world and took up the name of his ancestors. The goblins had also provided Harry with a simple enchantment they layered on similar blades which could remove the effect of the venom temporarily at the will of the user. Of course, Harry wouldn't use this sword in his training bout. Even though it had enchantments to temporarily blunt the blade, it would raise a whole lot of unnecessary questions amongst those around him. All these men knew that your blade was your pride, and none would ever deliberately blunt their sword. That's what training swords were for. Without the help of magic, the blunting of a sword was a permanent damaging of the weapon. You'd never get it back to its original state. Nor would anyone here believe he carried a pre-blunted sword as his main weapon. That would just make him look like an oaf. So after a few more swings, to get into a pace for practicing his sword forms, he removed the scabbard and made to hand his sword to a page for safekeeping. A call of "Harry" pulled him out of his hunt for a page to hold his sword. Looking over to the source of the call, Harry saw Lord Edwyle walking towards him with Maester Garrick in tow. The Lord stopped in front of Harry and stared at the sword for a moment. "That is a beautiful sword," he said. "I have never seen its like, and I have seen many famous swords." "What is it made of?" asked Maester Garrick. "Silver." "You must be jesting," Maester Garrick replied in shock. "Silver is too soft to form a good sword, and certainly not one of this quality. Though I concede that the color does seem correct for the metal. It is perhaps the greatest sword, forged by the most celebrated smiths of the land I come from," Harry stated with pride. "I can't claim to know the secrets of its make, because those secrets were held most jealously, but there is no doubt that the blade is a form of silver hardened beyond its normal attributes. Much as the gold in the hilt is hardened for use in the sword." "Gold," the maester exclaimed, staring in shock at the hilt of the sword which he had assumed was some form of polished bronze. "Such a sword would be priceless. Even the king does not have such a blade. What would it cost to commission such a sword? It could not be commissioned. There is no one in this world that knows the secrets to reforge it." Maester Garrick's eyes took on that hungry look he often had when discussing new knowledge and ideas with Harry. "Ah, secrets lost to the ages then, much like the secrets of Valyrian steel. How exciting." Harry had of course heard of Valyrian steel and seen the great sword hanging in Lord Stark's solar. He had observed the ripple of gray and black that spilled across the blade. It looked a lot like Damascus steel from his old world. Damascus steel was a wizarding creation, and had befuddled many a muggle given it originated from some of the many failed attempts by wizards to copy goblin forging techniques. Though in his brief time near Lord Stark's sword, he had felt fire magic wrapped tightly around the blade, which was certainly new. Something to look into. Maybe he should try to reforge Valyrian steel himself. Harry was sure there were some books in his library on how to make Damascus steel, which was probably at least halfway there. Either way, he was fairly confident Valyrian steel couldn't hold a candle to a proper goblin-forged blade. "Where did you come across such a sword then?" Lord Edwyle continued. "This sword was forged for an ancestor of mine who was a great warrior millennia ago." Harry turned the sword over, showing the names, Gryffindor, and Peverell, carved into the blade. "We have a similar ancient sword in our family," Lord Edwyle commented in response, pleasantly impressed by Harry's ancient familial sword. "Ice is made of Valyrian steel and had been passed down the main line of Starks since the founding of the house under Brandon the Builder. Surely to hold such a blade as this must show great status among your people, much as a Valyrian steel blade does in Westeros." Harry took a moment to consider this. It hadn't occurred to him yet that the blade he wore at his hip could denote something more to the people of Westeros than the fact he was armed. Looking at the opulent blade in his hand, he felt a bit dumb for a moment. Of course it would mean something to people. To these men, their sword was their life in a very real sense. And even if only the hilt was visible, it was gold with a giant ruby on the end of it after all. Casting his mind back to his travels so far, Harry considered that this might partially explain some of the more welcoming attitudes he received from the lords he had met even when posing as a simple merchant. They must have seen the sword and immediately thought he was a lord of some status. Well, that was certainly useful in its own way. Harry was now glad he had decided to carry the sword on his hip at all times. Still, he felt he should clarify for Lord Stark. The sword is not just passed down from one son to another. It must be earned by those who perform great deeds, Harry continued. It is a great honor to hold the sword carrying the names and deeds of my ancestors. Though it is true either way, that I am the last of my name. Lord Edwyle was left thinking on the implications of Harry's last statement. He hadn't fully realized that Harry and Doberic were the absolute last of the Peverells. He certainly seemed bereft of family, other than his brother, but to be the last was tragic, especially for a man who was quickly becoming a friend. If this is the last of the Peverells, then he should ensure they were kept close to the family. He owed it to the House of Stark and their Peverell matriarch, mother of the first Starks. Meanwhile, the crowd in the training yard had grown quiet as they digested the conversation and admired Harry's sword. Entertainment was hard to come by in this era, so stories of swords with vaunted histories tended to capture attention, even if it was just so they could later recount the story and claim to have seen the sword to friends in the tavern, obviously embellishing where appropriate. Many were now wondering what great deed would be required to earn a sword such as this, and who would decide such a great deed had occurred. Naturally, none of them guessed that a talking hat was the one to grant him the sword. They also wondered what skills they would see in the spars to follow if Lord Peverell was as great a warrior as the sword would imply. Certainly everyone was now anticipating a great show in the yard and no one was in a hurry to leave. They would not be disappointed. As Esser Castle returned with their protective gear, Harry was genuinely impressed with the quality of craftsmanship and durability of the simple leather training armor. The Starks may be frugal, but they clearly didn't skimp on quality in matters of war. It was a far cry from the enchanted robes and protective charms they were used to, but there was a certain charm to the simplicity of it all. As a page tightened the straps on Harry's gauntlets, he looked over at Sirius, who having his own armor fitted. They shared a knowing smile, both eager to test their skills against the master at arms and prove their worth in this unfamiliar world. Harry certainly intended to leave a lasting impression. Harry stepped onto the ring in the middle of the training yard, his muscles warming up as he ran through a few of his sword forms and footing exercises. He had finished donning the boiled leather armor they had put together for him and had picked out a blunted training sword similar in size and shape to the sword of Gryffindor. The training sword felt heavier in his hand, but nothing he couldn't compensate for. Sirius, on the other hand, walked into the yard swinging his training sword with little form but a lot of confidence. He seemed to be more focused on putting on a show than preparing for the upcoming matches. The first fight was between Harry and one of the guards. The guard was strong and had a solid stance, but Harry's speed and agility was a natural and easy counter to a strong opponent. He dodged and weaved around the guard's attacks, his movements fluid and graceful, occasionally deflecting a blow here or there. In the blink of an eye, Harry struck, his sword finding the necessary gap and swiftly smacking the guard on the arm, causing him to drop his sword. A classic disarming move. The onlookers cheered and clapped, still somewhat surprised by the ease with which Harry won the bout, despite his prior grand story about his sword. Next, Harry faced Esser Castle. Harry suspected this would be a more evenly matched challenge. The older man was clearly experienced and frankly, spent his entire life training with the sword. Harry was strong and had incredible reflexes honed during his days as a seeker, but he had only picked up the sword later in life. Since he wasn't applying any magic enhancements during this training bout, it would likely be a hard fight. Following a casual bow, they moved in and clashed, their swords ringing through the air as they exchanged a flurry of attacks and parries. Harry was right, Esser Castle had good reflexes and well-honed sword forms, but in the end, Harry had youth, and much greater endurance to his advantage. He also had the benefit of foreign sword forms, for which Esser Castle had no easy response. Whereas the forms Harry noted from Esser Castle matched well with Old English and French medieval forms, which he'd trained against quite extensively with the goblins. Harry's lithe form darted back and forth, narrowly avoiding Castle's powerful swings. At one point, Harry rolled to the side, evading a particularly vicious swipe that would have taken him out had it connected. This was definitely not a delicate duel, this was real sword fighting, rough and hard. Harry was loving it. He grinned and sprang back up, immediately launching a counterattack, his sword slashing through the air in a series of rapid, controlled movements to force Esser Castle into a defensive stance and to regain his own position after being knocked down. Castle, for his part, was not easily deterred. He met Harry's attacks with equal ferocity, his years of experience evident in his precise, calculated strikes. The sound of steel meeting steel echoed throughout the yard as the two combatants pushed each other to their limits. Despite the chilly air, Harry was sweating. This was exactly the exercise he'd been seeking. He grinned again and heaved the sword around to push forward, after two quick deflections had put him on the back foot. Despite Castle's impressive skill, Harry's speed and agility eventually won the day. He feinted to the left, drawing Castle's attention, then darted to the right and delivered a swift, decisive blow to his opponent's side, causing Esser Castle to stumble. Harry took the advantage and quickly dealt a follow-up blow to the shoulder blade, causing Esser Castle to drop his sword. The crowd murmured in appreciation, impressed by his skill. Everyone seemed quite pleased with the bout, even Esser Castle, who was panting and rubbing his side, but smiling from ear to ear. It had been a while since two such skilled parties had put on a display like that in the Winterfell yard. Lord Edwyle was well past the age for such things, though a twinkle in his eye suggested he wouldn't have minded testing his mettle against Harry, imagining the showings of his youth wistfully. The next two rounds followed a similar pattern, with Harry consistently outmaneuvering Esser Castle, much to the delight of the spectators. Then it was Sirius's turn to step into the yard. His first match was against another guard, and only through accidentally tripping did he avoid the first swing of his opponent. With a stroke of luck, after 3 deflections and a stumble, Sirius blindly swung back around and caught the guard's wrist, forcing him to drop his sword. Sirius was quite happy with the win, even though it was hard to attribute it to skill. However, as the following rounds played out, Sirius quickly learned that his dueling skills were quite rusty, and not well suited to the rougher swordplay of a medieval training yard. He struggled to maintain his footing and react to his opponent's attacks, losing as many rounds as he won. He wasn't terrible, just mostly average, and with that realization his confident blustering bravado began to fade, replaced by a more serious and determined demeanor. As the training session wound down, Sirius decided that he should spend time sharpening his old skills with the blade. Harry also quietly offered to teach Sirius the charms he himself had found in the Black Library for increasing strength and agility. This would certainly help him improve quickly and put him in a position to best most swordsmen. Though it was clear to Sirius that in order to keep up with Harry and hold his own against the best in this new world, he would need to put in the effort. He knew that the enhancement spells would lift his skill in a real fight for survival, but nothing beats actual practice. Those spells were just enhancements, not skills in and of themselves. Of course, Sirius consoled himself that, if it really came down to a matter of survival, he could just start throwing spells around and end things quickly. Sword fighting was clearly an important skill in this world, both to hide their magic, and as powerful status symbol. But if the chips were down, then all bets were off. He would be throwing out bombardas like confetti at a parade. Harry, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment after the training session. He had proven himself to be a formidable fighter, even in this foreign setting. However, he knew that there was always room for improvement and growth, and he vowed to continue practicing and refining his abilities whenever he got the chance. He decided that, despite the lack of danger so far, he would continue to carry his sword at his hip, much like the other nobles he had met in Westeros. The thought of engaging in real skirmishes as they journeyed through the medieval kingdoms caused him to smile. He was sure they would meet some truly skilled swordsmen in their travels, and he was keen to test his mettle against the best when the chance arose. Either way, it wouldn't do to get rusty in a world that seemed to value sword skills so highly. They'd definitely be coming back to the training yard on a more frequent basis while they were here. And maybe Harry would look into adding a training space to the tent. He might even be able to build some sort of autonomous training mannequin to battle against. Though, for now, they both agreed that what they most needed was rest. They felt the exhaustion and soreness that came with a day of intense physical activity. Working with a page boy to strip the armor, Harry thanked Sir Castle, and gave a nod of acknowledgement to Lord Edwyle, who was now across the other side of the yard speaking to some senior guardsmen. With the armor off, and their sore muscles starting to make themselves known, the two stumbled back down to the town for rest. Maybe he'd get Dobby to run him a nice bath with one of those soothing bath bombs, Harry thought in contentment. Chapter 16 Teaser. Quote, "He can't possibly have lost another horse," Lord Edwyle mumbled, attempting to reassure himself, only to have his denial dashed by Harry's first words. Harry called to them as he approached with a wave and a smile. "Lord Edwyle," he called, "I can't say this has ever happened to me before." He lowers the decibel as they approach closer, rubbing his head in an embarrassed manner, "But I seem to have misplaced my horse." Harry's not sure he's ever received such a skeptical and disappointed look in his life. Note: the next chapter is now up for free members on Patreon PanGalacticBard. If you would like to make comments or suggestions on the next draft chapter before it's published, you can head over there and have a look. If you would like to read even further ahead, or simply appreciate the story, I would welcome your donations. 2 comments 0 vote. Don't panic ch16, a horse of course. Chapter synopsis. Lord Edwyle reflects on the many changes brought on by Harry and his merry band. The state of the northern economy is in shambles, and he's been given the tools to lift it back up again. Can he follow through? He also has some very legitimate concerns about Harry's horse-related negligence. Last time, it is a great honor to hold the sword carrying the names and deeds of my ancestors. Though it is true either way, that I am the last of my name. Lord Edwyle was left thinking on the implications of Harry's last statement. He hadn't fully realized that Harry and Dobby were the absolute last of the Peverells. He certainly seemed bereft of family, other than his brother, but to be the last was tragic, especially for a man who was quickly becoming a friend. Chapter 16. A horse of course. Lord Edwyle gazed out his window, contemplating quietly as he awaited his guests. His servants would say he was brooding. But that was a natural Stark trait, so no one thought much of it. In his left hand he held the journal of Torrhen Stark, the Kneeler. He'd been reading journal religiously for the last several days, and it still left him speechless. He felt like the wool had been pulled back from his eyes and he wasn't entirely happy with what he could now see. How had the North fallen so far in just 300 years? The Journal of the Last King of Winter was an eye-opener. It covered all manner of everyday life for the brave man who gave up his kingdom for his people. But more importantly, it shared observations on the state of the northern economy at that time, and it was thriving. Mine sites were mentioned that Lord Edwyle knew did not exist today. Trade routes over the land seemed to have faded from the current maps, and a number of major vassal houses that made the North strong back in the day have since fallen to ruin. Those vassal houses had died out for any number of reasons, and that in itself wasn't suspicious, but the lack of action to build new houses and man the many forts of the North was indeed suspicious. It spoke of a long campaign to see the North fester and fail. To keep even the Warden of the North ignorant of so much to do with his homeland, must have taken a concerted effort over a very long time. The worst part was that Lord Edwyle could easily see it being a plot by the Maesters, or the Faith, or the Targaryens, or all three. To all these parties, the Starks were a quiet but clear threat to their power. It was the only explanation that made sense. If the journal was to be believed, the North was a true powerhouse before the conquest, possibly the most powerful of the kingdoms in Westeros at the time. It had more gold in its mountains than the Westerlands. It had a naval and trade fleet on both coasts that ruled their respective seas with impunity. Strange that the vassal houses which ran these fleets were among the first to fall. It had strong trade ties with most houses in the Sunset Sea, and ties with the larger cities in Essos. Then the Targaryens had come through and taken the northern fleet to form the base of their newly formed royal fleet, as part of the agreement with Torrhen not to burn through the north as they had in the Reach and Riverlands. Edwyle was furious at that revelation. He had always believed the tales that the North had no strength at sea ever since Brandon the Burner had burnt the fleet in a fit of grief over 1,000 years ago. Since the story was so well known, it had seemingly become fact. A story that on reflection made no sense at all, but had the effect of making the Starks look stupid and weakening the North. If he believed the journal, and he did, then the North's seafaring vassal houses had hidden most of their fleets from their batty overlord at the time, and simply set about rebuilding what they lost with the full support of the next, slightly more sane, Stark. More importantly, the journal mentioned this rebuilding was done in the many shipyards that dotted the protected coves of Sea Dragon Point and the Bay of Seals. Two areas of the North that now lay abandoned and devoid of strong houses to oversee them. Of course that's what happened, Edwyle mumbled to himself, letting out an exasperated sigh. If I tried to burn the Manderley's fleet, all I would get is a black eye and some very miffed neighbors. It would hardly stop them trading or stop them from replacing the boats, probably at my expense. Stupid really, for anyone to believe this mythical story. How would Brandon have even got his hands on the entire fleet to burn if they were constantly out plying their trade on the seas? And boy was there a lot of trade going around. The journal didn't go into detail on the numbers, but it was clear the North thrived on its trade. It seems their closest allies at the time were the seafaring kingdom of Bravos. It made sense to Edwyle that they would be close to the down-to-earth people of Bravos. The only other peoples that really understood what it meant to live in the cold of the North, despite being on another continent. Well, not the only people, Edwyle muttered, turning his thoughts to one of the other more startling revelations. The journal had gone into great detail on King Torrhen's plans to reopen trade with the then. A trade relationship that had apparently been dormant for over a century by that time, ever since the burning of Hardhome, which was the main trade port north of the Wall. It was a shock to Lord Edwyle that this then relationship was built on a dormant Stark alliance from the Age of Heroes that King Torrhen apparently still respected despite its dormancy. Before Aegon started his war, Torrhen had been working with his advisors on the logistics of getting a trade corridor back up and running. Lord Edwyle was still struggling to process this particular revelation, having grown up with the apparently mistaken belief that the Starks had nothing but enemies beyond the Wall. Lord Edwyle's own father was slain in battle by a false king from beyond the Wall. But he had no reason to believe the Thenns were involved with that travesty of justice. Not that it matters, Edwyle sighed, I wouldn't know how to get in touch with the Thenns even if I wanted to. A quick scan of the library had turned up no useful information on their apparent northern neighbors. Another strike in Edwyle's book for the state of things being the result of enemy action. Knowledge on your neighbors doesn't just disappear by itself. The Maesters had a lot to answer for, it seems. At least he didn't have to worry about Maester Garrick. The man was a third son from a small house sworn to the Umbers, and was a Northman through and through. The work he'd put in with Harry recently was just proof of how enthusiastic he was about improving the North. So it was clear whatever plot existed, it wasn't so obvious or direct, at least in this generation. Some of the older moves were now clear as day to Edwyle though. The most glaring being the stripping of the land in the new gift from the houses of the North. That strip of land was larger than the Riverlands, and according to the journal, it was much more fertile. It had been referred to as the bread basket of the North back in Torrhen's day and had single-handedly supported the entire food needs of the then much larger northern population, even providing enough excess grain for trade to make the Reach green with jealousy. Even more green, Edwyle snickered, glad no one was there to hear his terrible joke. So why now was that strip of land laying empty while the North starved through every winter? That would be the not-so-subtle actions of the Targaryens and the Faith of the Seven. The well-known story was that the wife of King Jaehaerys had been impressed with the valor, bravery, and loyalty of the Night's Watch. So had convinced the king to grant the new gift to the Watch as a sign of supreme generosity and appreciation. A nice enough story to keep the small folk happy, but I smell a rat, Edwyle thought with chagrin. After all, Jaehaerys the Conciliator was mainly known for his efforts to appease the faith and bring them back into the fold after the uprising of the faith militant during the reign of his predecessors. Now Edwyle wondered how much of that appeasing came at the expense of the North. It was no secret that the faith had been trying to weaken the North and destroy their faith in the old gods since the Andal invasion had been turned back at Moat Cailin. He knew very well that when the faith preached about the savages in the North, they didn't just mean the wildlings beyond the wall. For thousands of years, the North had been the one holdout against the faith in Westeros, and a powerful one at that. Then not 50 years after Aegon's conquest, the food basket of the North was given away and Moat Cailin was largely demolished to provide materials for Jaehaerys' supposed King's Road. More like a dirt track, Edwyle griped. I'm sure not a single stone from the castle was actually used in that road. It was all so clear to Edwyle now, but what was he even to do about it? What could he do to bring back the strength of the North? All he had ever done was try to keep the North together and their mouths fed. It was all he could afford to do. Now he had chests full of gold sitting in the crypts ready to use, and some long-needed inspiration from his ancestors to rebuild the North as it should be. Perhaps the arrival of Harry and all his ideas and inventions at this junction was destined to be. They came in at just the right time, like the first rays of sunlight in spring, spreading their good fortune to Winterfell in the North. Edwyle snorted at himself. He was so dramatic. His son always gave him a hard time over it, but Edwyle secretly thought he would have made a great bard or mummer if fate had dealt him a different hand. Even so, it wasn't so hard to see the seismic shifts that Harry had brought to Winterfell. Not least of which was the finding of the journal itself, by none other than the last descendant of the original Stark matriarch, Lady Iolanthe Peverell. Edwyle wasn't daft, and the coincidences were piling up surrounding this mysterious new friend and distant kin, but all those coincidences were coming up in his favor, leaving Lord Stark to wonder if Harry was sent by the old gods themselves. He certainly had far more knowledge of magics than he seemed to think anyone had noticed. He sighed at the thought, and made a move to tuck the journal back into the safety of the hidden vault in the floor of his solar, below a movable direwolf statue. The last item of note was of course the most dangerous, and the most crucial to keep secret. That being the Stark family magics that were spoken of in the journal. Magics that he had been taught to believe were only old wives' tales and myths. Some of the suggestions Harry made of using soil fertility wards and weather moderation wards tied to weirwood trees were spoken of in the journal as though that was normal practice for the Starks. True, Edwyle was easily accepting of magic, and had only been shocked for a moment by Peverell's mastery of the topic. After all, the North had many stories about the magics of the first men and the old gods had no problem with the idea of such power being wielded by men. But if someone had told him a sennight ago that he would soon begin to rediscover the Stark magics and the Winterfell wardstone, he would have had them sent to the Maester to be checked up. Even with the journal in his hand and the little he had so far read from the scrolls in the crypts, Edwyle didn't have a good grasp on the topic of magic. It was truly a godsend to have Harry there to decipher and improve the wardstone under Winterfell. Not for the first time, he wondered whether Lord Harry was actually working on some long-lost Peverell instruction to rescue the Starks should they ever fall, and fallen they had. Of course, Harry could be here just by happenstance, but it seemed curious nonetheless. For all he knew, the Peverells might have spirited this journal away on the behest of King Torrhen, who clearly remembered old alliances that the Starks of today had long forgotten. Maybe these Peverells carried this journal with them as an heirloom until such time as its knowledge could be used again. They could easily have used the discovery of the secret rooms in the crypts as a method of handing over the journal without raising too much suspicion. He glanced at the now hidden safe, and pondered. It seemed his family had a true friend in the Peverell family, regardless of the truth of these matters. He steeled himself, and turned back to his desk, making the same conclusion he had made every day since reading that journal. The Starks would fall no further. Harry was already working on proposals, ones that he could now afford to experiment with given the generous treasury in the crypts, and he'd do his own research on those wardstones using the scrolls on family magics also held in that crypt treasury. Dispersing such magics across the land would be a long-term project, and with Harry being a bit of a traveler, he'd not ask him to lay all those stones across the north, or even just across the Stark lands in the north. No, it would have to be the Starks who picked up that task, as they did in the past. But he would be ever thankful to his distant kin for bringing back a piece of their history, and a piece of their family power. At that last thought, he heard the knock at the door that would likely be Harry and Maester Garrick, bringing their finalized project proposals and blueprints. He called them in, smiling warmly at Harry as he carried several unwieldy maps and parchments into the room. And so begins the rise of the Starks, he thought to himself, snorting again, so dramatic. After another day to finish up the blueprints, along with a rough map of the first proposed road to White Harbor, Harry and Maester Garrick finally felt ready to present their proposals to Lord Edwyle Stark. They'd kept him loosely appraised of the discussions to date, but he'd been preoccupied with lordly duties, as is to be expected of a northern lord at the end of winter, so was still awaiting a proper briefing. They gathered their carefully drawn diagrams, cost estimates, and explanations for each project and made their way to Lord Edwyle's solar. Harry was pleased with how invested Lord Edwyle seemed in the projects and plans he and Maester Garrick were putting forward. Edwyle's interest in the mills and water wheels was to be expected, as they had already broached some of these ideas in passing conversation, along with some of the farming techniques. But Harry was honestly astonished at how well he took to the idea of new roads. Harry had assumed the roads project would be the hardest sell, with most discounting the necessity of quality roads after hearing the cost. But Lord Edwyle's ears seemed to pick up at the mention of increased trade. It seemed he was keen to see a lift to the economy, and this was a clear route to start achieving it. Harry had actually been prepared to use a mild compulsion charm to encourage Lord Edwyle and Maester Garrick to fund this first road to Winterfell, but it seemed that would be entirely unnecessary. Personally, Harry was more excited by water wheel and windmill designs, which would inevitably revolutionize the forging of steel and the speed of lumber preparation. Both of which were crucial not just to military purposes, but to enhanced farming. Though it was understandable that Edwyle and Garrick didn't have the right insight to see the bigger picture yet. Cheaper, faster steel production could lead to actual steel farming equipment after all. A steel plow, which he hadn't included in this round of proposals, would be a game changer, but he wanted them to take this one step at a time. Roads and simple mills were the tentative step. With the knowledge that his treasury was now in a better position to fund these projects, thanks to Harry's astonishing find in the crypts of Winterfell, Lord Edwyle knew he could afford to set the plans in motion. Never had the Starks been able to hit the ground running after a long winter, usually having to scrimp and save the first harvest tax revenue to replenish the coffers. That being said, the Starks were known for their cautiousness for a reason, and Edwyle wanted to approach these new projects with the same level of prudence. It was agreed amongst the three of them that these projects would need to start small with one watermill and one windmill, as the mills would require some experimentation, and the craftsmen would be learning on the job as they build each. The farming methods would also cause quite a bit of consternation and suspicion amongst the small folk, who had no reason to believe this new way was better. All those of the north knew that taking risks on your crops could spell death if the harvest were to fail as a result. It had happened in the past. Lord Edwyle sensibly declared that they would start only on the lands immediately around Winterfell, and he would personally guarantee the income and harvest ration expected from a normal harvest for those small folk farmers, which he would be able to dole out from the usual harvest tithes from his vassals. Lord Edwyle also proposed working with House Manderley to fund the new road to White Harbor. Even with their treasury, it would be hard to justify funding the entire route, and the Manderleys would equally benefit from the construction. As the North's largest trade port, it made sense to connect White Harbor to both the South and the North with better roads. By involving the Manderleys, Lord Stark hoped to create a sense of shared investment in the project and demonstrate the benefits of collaboration between the northern houses. Together, they began to outline the next steps needed to bring these projects to fruition. 2 days later, after a bit of back and forth around the logistics involved in these projects, they were ready to get things started. Harry, Lord Edwyle and a small retinue of guards rode the surrounding farmlands, surveying the possible locations suitable for the first watermill and windmill constructions. It only took a short time to land on an exposed plot atop a hill that they both agreed would be perfect for the first windmill when they eventually got that project off the ground. Though the right spot for a watermill was trickier to find, with the needs for fast-moving water and solid banks that could support a large structure. They had also sent out messengers earlier in the day to arrange for a gathering of the small folk farmers and farmhands to speak with their lord, and to receive instruction from Harry on the process of the new four-field crop rotation. The farmers were all in awe of being addressed directly by their lord, and seemed more than willing to follow his every word without question, puffing up with pride when he told them of the great good this would do for the North. This unquestioning loyalty was a little disturbing to Harry's sensibilities, but it was the way of this world. He was just glad he knew these instructions would see greater crop returns. He shuddered to think of what would happen if an unwitting lord mucked up instructions issued by an incompetent maester. Starvation probably. On the plus side, the farmers knew their plots like the back of their hand, and it only took a moment for them to point out the best spot for a water mill. Not that they yet knew what a water mill was. They were just happy to help their lord. With the instructions given, and a spot by a fast-moving river marked out for the watermill, Harry found himself short of anything further to take his attention. Lord Stark was finalizing his meeting with the gathered farmers and addressed some minor grievances while he was there. These minutiae of local administration held no interest for Harry, so to while away the time, he trotted his horse down the hill to drink from a nearby stream and rest by the waterside. Harry patiently passed the time skipping stones across the water as his horse drank. Just as he was preparing to remount and head back to the others, he spotted a small cluster of standing stones surrounding a weirwood hidden deep among the trees. Harry quickly strode off in their direction, seeking to investigate in the hopes of finding more First Men runes. Jace, son of Mace, was wandering the quiet forest this evening, having no more chores and, knowing his father was off meeting their great lord, he had naught to do but wander and play. He was surprised therefore, to come across an unattended horse trotting through the stream. Jace was well versed in horse handling, dealing with them on a regular basis on the farm, so it was no chore, even with his smaller child's size, to grasp the reins and bring the horse to heel. Seeing the Stark livery emblazoned on the saddle, it was no mystery where the horse belonged. Looking around, he confirmed there wasn't another soul to be found in the area. Jace figured this beauty must have run off from the castle at some point. Jace was sure he'd get a few small coins in hand from their generous lord for recovering his horse. So he mounted up and began the several-league trot up toward the castle, enjoying the chance to ride a thoroughbred war horse instead of their small farm pony for once. This was turning out to be a great day. After a fairly trying conversation on some land rights amongst a few squabbling farmers, Lord Stark moved off with his retinue in the direction of the stream he'd seen Harry head towards, somewhere over the next hill. Cresting the small hill, Lord Edwyle was not expecting to see Harry already walking towards him on foot. He had been reticent to lend Harry a horse, despite his seeming competence in all other matters of life. Lord Edwyle could not shake the memory of the constant trickle of raven messages telling him of the mysterious but friendly merchants making their way down through the north, and consistently, every single time, managing to misplace their horse before reaching the next town. "Where is his horse?" he pointlessly asks his men with some exasperation. Groaning and palming his face, he asks one more time, with more quiet desperation, "Where is his horse? Does anyone see his horse? He'll have tied it by that copse of trees," a guard suggested, sure of himself, since he'd not learned of Harry's propensity with negligent horse misplacement. "He can't possibly have lost another horse," Lord Edwyle mumbled, attempting to reassure himself, only to have his denial dashed by Harry's first words. Harry called to them as he approached with a wave and a smile. "Lord Edwyle," he called, "I can't say this has ever happened to me before." He lowers the decibel as they approach closer, rubbing his head in an embarrassed manner, "but I seem to have misplaced my horse." Harry's not sure he's ever received such a skeptical and disappointed look in his life. Almost despondent in its deadpan delivery. "I think," Lord Edwyle finally says, releasing a breath, "that I'll send for a carriage to fetch you." Nodding as though he's solved a persistent problem, Lord Edwyle sends a guard back to the castle to fetch a carriage, and a stable boy to watch the horses. He quietly asks the guard to ensure the horses are tied firmly to the carriage and that the stable boy watches them at all times. Chapter 17 Teaser. A sudden shiver ran down his spine, and the hairs on his neck rose like someone was watching him. This was more than a gut feeling, it was a clear warning from his magic, a subtle sense that served him well during the Wizarding War, and he knew better than to ignore it. Note: the next chapter is now up for free members on Patreon PanGalacticBard. If you would like to make comments or suggestions on the next draft chapter before it's published, you can head over there and have a look. If you would like to read even further ahead, or simply appreciate the story, I would welcome your donations. 2 comments 0 vote. Don't panic CH17. Watching the Watchers, Sensitive Matters. Chapter 17 Synopsis. What starts as a simple snack run turns into a spy hunting mission for Harry. With Sirius by his side and Dobby doing his best to help, Harry uncovers a network of traitors operating right under Lord Stark's nose. Things get intense as the trio scrambles to stop a malicious and possibly deadly plot. Last time, to keep even the Warden of the North ignorant of so much to do with his homeland, must have taken a concerted effort over a very long time. The worst part was that Lord Edwyle could easily see it being a plot by the Maesters, or the Faith, or the Targaryens, or all three. To all these parties, the Starks were a quiet but clear threat to their power. It was the only explanation that made sense. Chapter 17. Watching the Watchers, Sensitive Matters. Harry stifled a yawn as he trudged through the halls of the castle, feeling a tad tired having spent the evening copying more books from the library. He was cheered though, by the warm tart he was chomping down on, having just pilfered it from under gaze of the kitchen maids, for an evening snack. That cheeriness seemed to snap when a sudden shiver ran down his spine, and the hairs on his neck rose like someone was watching him. This was more than a gut feeling, it was a clear warning from his magic, a subtle sense that served him well during the Wizarding War, and he knew better than to ignore it. With practiced ease, Harry hid his reaction and continued on as if nothing were amiss, just casually strolling through the castle corridors while keeping an eye out for any clue as to what triggered his gut reaction. As he rounded a corner which would take him momentarily out of sight of anyone trying to follow him, Harry stepped into the shadows and cast a strong disillusionment charm. Now functionally invisible, Harry waited for the mysterious follower to appear. Casting a quick stunner on the person that rounded the corner a few moments later, Harry was surprised to note they appeared to be an innocuous kitchen hand. Having learned a healthy level of paranoia from Mad-Eye Moody in the war, Harry decided to check his facts regardless of how innocent the person looked. They might be here on legitimate business, but he couldn't think of a reason for a kitchen hand to follow him towards the library away from the kitchen, and he had learned to trust his gut feelings. Harry reached out with his magic for a passive legilimency scan, and what he found left him deeply troubled. This kitchen hand was broadcasting quite loudly that he was acting as a spy, and had been asked to follow Harry for some extra coin. Without hesitation, Harry conjured ropes to bind the spy and apparated them both back to his tent for further interrogation. Upon arrival in the tent, Harry securely tied the spy to a chair. He then launched a full-blown legilimency attack without bothering to wake the spy up, diving into the spy's mind. It felt like wading through a murky river, as he sifted through the kitchen hand's memories, trying his hardest to ignore the irrelevant information. After all, he really didn't need to know that Josie the scullery maid was laying with Walden from the market. Or that Walden was also laying with Josie's sister. It seems this kitchen hand was the town gossip, as well as a spy, though he supposed the skills were relatively interchangeable. Eventually, he locked onto the thread about the spy's work. It was concerning but not surprising to learn that his focus was on Lord Stark and his immediate family. The kitchen hand took coin from a hidden spymaster in town to report any goings in Lord Stark's domain. Diving deeper, Harry found that the kitchen hand knew of at least one other spy in the castle and suspected his spymaster had others scattered throughout the north. He didn't know the name of this spymaster, but conveniently had a deodrop in town that he knew was scheduled to be checked by the spymaster tonight. The man had already dropped a note there, speaking of the mysterious foreign merchant lords that appeared to be new allies of Lord Stark. That was definitely information Harry didn't want to get out. It might not be a surprise, but the confirmation that Lord Stark's home was infested with spies actually left Harry with a sense of righteous anger. Lord Stark was not only his friend, he was also clearly working in the interests of his people, and any spies could only be working in contrast to this goal. He really wasn't all that surprised that people were willing to pay good coin for information on the Warden of the North, but it didn't sit right with Harry, and he definitely wouldn't be leaving this alone. For now, Harry apparated the kitchen hand to one of the old barracks-style sleeping rooms that the elves had previously occupied in his camping tent. Vanishing some of the beds, Harry transfigured a temporary row of metal barred cells to contain any spies he captured. The hunt was on. The light of the moon cast eerie shadows over the snow-covered streets of Wintertown as Harry, Sirius, and Dobby embarked on their clandestine mission. Harry had informed them of the spy situation after Sirius had asked why they had a man trussed up in a cage. Not that he was judging, just curious. Naturally, Sirius and Dobby had insisted on accompanying Harry to root out the rest of the spy network. The trio stealthily made their way through the quiet streets towards the site of the Deodrop, their strong disillusionment charms rendering them almost invisible. Earlier scouting had shown the location to be a rented townhouse on the edge of the market. Harry suspected this was where the spymaster actually resided, which didn't seem like the most sophisticated operation to Harry, but then he wasn't sure what to expect from what amounted to medieval spies. Slipping inside the house quietly, they began a thorough search for documents and evidence. Dobby was fairly quick to point out the life sign he sensed upstairs, elves being particularly attuned to that sort of thing. Moving as quietly as shadows, they crept up the stairs and were met with an unexpected sight. The spymaster, a middle-aged woman with a sharp, calculating gaze, stood by the bedroom door, a dagger in hand. She lunged at Dobby, but the elf was quick to react. With a snap of his fingers, he stunned the spymaster, while Harry and Sirius, drawing on their wartime experience, cast Protega shields to protect their friend. Harry liked it when people made things easy for him. To be fair, an experienced spymaster laying in wait with a dagger could be a danger to anyone else, but to a magical it was just a convenience to find them here, instead of having to give chase. Harry sat back on a conjured armchair in front of his cages. He was waiting on Sirius to measure out the Veritaserum, and in the meantime, reading through the documents they'd snagged in their hunt. There weren't many documents, given how expensive parchment is, and the notes were conveniently short and to the point, probably so they could be hidden easily in transit. Harry looked up to see Sirius pouring a Veritaserum-spiked glass of water down the prisoner's throat. The potion allowed for a much easier interrogation than a legilimency probe, with less chance of missing vital information. A thorough Veritaserum interrogation did still require some skill. If someone had a well-organized mind and a strong enough willpower, they could hide information by only answering the exact question, with no prevarication. An interrogator would have to craft each question to extract as much information as possible. Thankfully, Harry liked to think he was pretty skilled in this sort of interrogation after his experience in the Wizarding War. "Who do you work for?" Harry demanded, once he saw the woman's eyes glaze over, showing the potion had taken effect. "I have 2 masters," she admitted in a stilted response, her voice eerily calm under the influence of the truth potion. "I was originally sent north by the Tullys, and later, I was discovered and hired by the Targaryen's Master of Whispers." Harry and Sirius exchanged a glance, their expressions grim. The Targaryens were a powerful family, and their involvement complicated matters significantly. Harry sighed, this went deeper than he'd thought, best to just get as much information as possible and figure out next steps. "What instructions were you given setting up this network?" Harry asked. "I am to gather information on the goings-on in Winterfell and report back to my masters," she replied. "I'm also tasked with identifying any weaknesses or vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Any opportunity to weaken the North should be taken if it doesn't risk revealing my network or the influence of outsiders in the North." It seemed this was also an espionage operation. Harry sighed. At least he knew they hadn't discovered the water wheels and other plans yet. The note he'd intercepted from the kitchen hand seemed to be the only one that hinted at his interactions. Though he expected there might be 1 or 2 other southern houses with spy networks here, so he couldn't truly know how effectively they'd hidden the plans to uplift the North. He'd make an effort to cast a targeted notice me not on all the relevant documents he and Maester Garrick had prepared, but the best action would be to weed out all the spies. "Have you been given any specific targets?" Harry inquired. "Not at the moment, but my masters expect me to be prepared to act against anyone who might threaten their interests." "How do you send your reports?" Sirius cut in. "I use a network of ravens to send my reports to my masters," she explained. "I have a hidden rookery in a secluded location where I can send and receive messages without arousing suspicion." That was good to know. He'd ask Dobby to dismantle that rookery later. "What are your plans for the future?" Harry asked, his voice steely. "I will continue to serve my masters until they no longer require my services or I am caught," she answered without hesitation. Harry continued with his questioning, getting a bit deeper into the information she'd been asked to gather, and other activities, until Sirius jumped in with a crucial question. "Tell us all the spies and sources in your network. We want everything you know on them, including names, positions, and especially their intended purpose in your network." The spymaster seemed to struggle for a moment, clearly not wanting to share the full breadth of her network. Her eyes glazed over again as she began to list names in a flat emotionless voice. "Who among these spies are the most dangerous?" Who poses a risk if they find you've been taken? Harry added, after taking down all the names and details of the network both here in Winterfell and across the north. He suspected there were more that this spymaster wasn't privy to, but this was a major boon in taking down the network of two major southern powers nonetheless. There is a sworn sword of the heir Lord Rickard Stark who is both a spy and a trained assassin, a knight in Lord Edwyle's protection detail, and I've recently managed to insert a trained poisoner into the newer batch of Lady's maids serving his wife, Lady Marina Stark. Even through the haze, Harry could tell this woman was smug at how successfully she'd inserted such deadly assets into the household. Though Harry conceded she had a somewhat morbid right to be smug. With one order this woman could practically behead the Kingdom of the North. Sirius seemed to be of the same mind with his next question. What are their orders if they discover you've gone missing? Are they to take any action? Sirius asked. She almost smiled, and in her still monotone voice replied, I have not specifically instructed on what action to take, but I decoded some secret instructions passed through me to the 3 spies in the household from the Master of Whispers. He's a dangerous man. All 3 were instructed to make every effort to dispose of their targets if they suspect they've been discovered. She seemed to struggle further, but there was no breaking the hold of Veritaserum. Sirius had been very careful to measure out the right dose. They're to make it look like an attack by the Ironborn, the Myrtels, or the Wildlings, depending on how they set up the assassination. Even just calling out a family motto while committing the act could throw enough suspicion to hide the Targaryen's hand in this. Would any of them know you're missing yet? Dobby asked, having been silent for most of the interrogation, simply contemplating. Sirius and Harry looked at each other in alarm, having not thought to ask that, and now worried. They could have personally triggered an assassin to take action. The woman seemed to smirk ever so slightly, showing that the Veritaserum was staring to lose its effect. Oh, they know, they'll all know. Your kitchen hand friend over there wasn't the only drop planned tonight, and I have fail-safes in place that will even reach the ear of Lord Rickard's sworn sword. She said this as she gestured to the unconscious kitchen hand still trussed up in the other cell. Quote. Shit, was all Harry could say before Sirius stunned the woman, and made to grab his sword. Not really needing anything more than a look between them, the trio apparated to a copse of trees just outside the gates of Winterfell. Quote. Shit, Harry breathed to himself, as they stumbled onto the road and jogged to the gates, desperately hoping they weren't too late. They couldn't just enter the castle without raising suspicion on themselves, but going through the gate was just another step between them and the assassins. Shit. As they approached the gates, Harry called up to the night watchmen, who were understandably wary of letting anyone in at such a late hour. We're sorry, but we cannot allow you entry at this time, one of the guards said, his face stern. And we cannot wake Lord Edwyle unless there's an urgent matter. Sirius, losing patience, narrowed his eyes at the soldiers. This is a matter of utmost importance and concerns the safety of Lord Edwyle and his family. The guards remained unmoved, shaking their heads. Our orders are clear. We cannot disturb our lord for any reason unless it's a matter of life and death. This is exactly that, Harry added, knowing they weren't going to get anywhere with these guards. Unable to tolerate the delay he made to wave a compulsion over them, but was beaten to the punch by Sirius who was apparently already in the process of surreptitious casting compulsion on the guards, ensuring their cooperation. The change in their demeanor was immediate, and one of the guards rushed off to wake the Master-at-Arms, who then went to rouse Lord Edwyle. After much commotion, the trio were shown into the Great Hall, where Lord Edwyle, cloaked in his great black fur coat over his pajamas, observed them with some consternation. It was clear Lord Edwyle had been burning the midnight oil in his solar, reviewing their plans. Though his wife, Lady Marina, who the trio weren't as closely connected with, stood by his side and had all the signs of having been woken for this disruption. Their Master-at-Arms, Esser Castle, stood behind them and to the side, looking wary but curious. We may have begun the bonds of friendship, Lord Peverell, but this is beyond the pale, Lord Edwyle began, his voice deep and powerful. What reasons have you to wake the household at this hour? He insisted with all the grim gravitas of a Lord Paramount, reminding them of his power. Harry cringed, knowing he would be just as unhappy at being disturbed so late into the night like this, but he was sure Lord Stark would forgive them once he heard what they had to say. Harry stepped forward to explain, "We apologize for the late hour, my lord, but this could not wait. It's a matter of life and death. Of your life for that matter. For the safety of your family this absolutely could not wait." This clearly caught Lord Edwyle's attention and he leant forward speaking with more urgency now. If that is the case then speak quickly Lord Peverell. For I would see any threats to my family's safety taken care of at once. Taking a breath and glancing at Sirius, Harry launched into his tale, starting with his discovery of the kitchen hand following him in the castle, and leading on to their clandestine adventure this night. Lord Edwyle's face progressively darkened with anger at each revelation. The mentions of spycraft were shocking, but espionage was even more appalling. More than anything though, the threat of assassination against his family had Lord Edwyle burning with fury. Lady Marina also seemed more awake now, her eyes widening in shock. The atmosphere amongst the small retinue in the Great Hall grew tense as they realized the gravity of the situation. When Harry reached the end of his tale and disclosed the names and positions of the known spies and assassins close to the family, Lord Edwyle leapt up in a rage. While Lady Marina sat in shock with her eyes wide and her face pale. To think that these snakes are so close to be within striking distance, Lord Edwyle growled, pacing with his hand on the pommel of his sword, looking to draw it at any moment. Anyone with control over the spymaster could have wiped out the Stark family with the stroke of their hand. This state of affairs cannot continue. I will not allow a threat to go unanswered. And I will take no chances with the lives of my family. These spies and their like will face the sword, Lord Stark grit out with his hand gripping hard on the handle of his sword as he paced. Pausing to look around at the small retinue with him in the hall, Lord Edwyle took a brief moment to contemplate his next action, thinking out loud. The spies in the castle should be easy to capture with the element of surprise. The difficulty will be getting to Rickard's sworn sword before word reaches them. We have no way of knowing what method this harlot used to set up the failsafe she mentioned to notify them of her capture. Lord Stark looked piercingly at Harry, not angry at the man-purse, but at the news he brought. If your interrogation proves true, this assassin will seek to kill my son. He roared again in rage and hurled a cup against the wall, getting some satisfaction in its smashing. Lady Stark seemed to have gathered herself at this point and added in panicked but intelligent voice, Rickard and his retinue left just over a sennight ago on a tour of the houses and lands worst hit by the recent winter. If they are still in the rills then a mounted party could catch up to them with a day's hard ride. She looked at Esser Castle as she said this, practically begging him to get things moving. Stopping and seeming to think for a moment, Lord Stark turned to his master-at-arms with a steely resolve and growled, "Ring the castle bells. We need a riding party armed and mounted without a moment to lose. And you," he gestured to the small retinue of night guards, present in the hall for the disturbance. "We have known spies in our halls, hunt them down and take them into custody." Esser Castle just nodded stoically and ran quickly out of the room towards the gatehouse, yelling for the guards to follow him. A moment later they heard the deep gong of the bells ring out over the castle, followed by shouts and the sound of many moving feet. Sirius observed the chaos around him, thinking that despite the seriousness of the situation, it was all rather exciting. He really needed to stick closer to Harry if this is what happened around him all the time. He had thought there was no way Harry could find trouble sitting in a library all day, but this certainly proved him wrong on that count. Hearing the click of a door off to at the back of the hall behind the Starks, Sirius looked up to see the new handmaiden shuffle in, trying not to gather any notice. She was clearly here to find out what was going on, and probably gain some juicy information for her spymaster. Well, not on his watch. Sirius darted past the Starks, startling both the Starks and the handmaiden hidden in the shadows behind them. Seeing the handmaiden start to draw a knife from her sleeve, he reached out and grabbed her forearm with an iron grip, pushing the knife back into its sheath. "Don't even think about it," Sirius growled, "the game's up, we know who you work for." The girl's eyes widened in shock for just a moment, then her mask fell and a look of disgust covered her face. "Unhand me, you northern heathen," she spat out, "you have no idea who you're dealing with. I have friends in high places. You would do well to hold your tongue," came the sharp voice of Lady Stark from over Sirius' shoulder, "you have no friends in the north. Not anymore. Like I need the help of savages like yourselves," the handmaiden said, struggling in futility as Sirius handed her over to one of the remaining guards. "The light of the seven will keep me safe." "I doubt it," finished Lady Stark, turning slightly to address the guard, "take her to the deepest darkest cell you can find. We will deal with her later." This was one of her personal staff after all, she'd be particularly vindictive in interrogating this monster. They watched as the guard led the former handmaiden, now prisoner, towards the door, passing through the small crowd that had started to gather in the hall in response to the bells still ringing through the night. Only for a blur of motion to catch everyone off guard as a man from the slowly gathering crowd drew his sword and lunged towards the prisoner and her guard. The move came so fast that most only saw a blur out of the corner of their eyes, followed almost immediately by an almighty clang when the attacker's sword met an immovable force. Lord Stark had reached for his sword as soon as he saw the motion, with reflexes honed through previous wars and sharpened in the training yard over many years. Though he knew there was no way he would be fast enough to save the guard. Only to be caught by surprise when he saw the assailant's sword had come to a violent rest against Lord Harry's distinctive silver blade. Lord Stark was stunned, wondering how he had reacted so fast, and sure in his mind that Harry was on the other side of the room a moment ago. Though with everything happening so fast, he could have been wrong. Harry swiftly disarmed the assailant who was now visible as the knight in Lord Stark's retinue that had been outed as a spy. "Thank you, Lord Harry," Lord Stark intoned. "It seems you and Lord Sirius have made a habit of saving my family and my men tonight. It will not be forgotten." Turning to the guard he said, "Another traitor for the cells." He gestured at the knight, "Keep guard over them until you are relieved. We cannot allow them to escape and send word to their compatriot with my son." Watching as the knight was led out of the room towards the cells, Lord Edwyle mused that he should never have bothered letting a knight into his retinue in the first place. Knighthood was a southern custom. Only those that followed the Seven could take the oath of knighthood. An oath this knight clearly didn't keep to. It was no great loss, either way, since Lord Harry had just made the knight's sword skills seem like those of a child. Lord Edwyle's musings were interrupted by Esser Castle jogging back into the hall, followed by an additional retinue of now very alert guardsmen. "The mounted men are ready, my lord," he declared, with the clipped calm under pressure of a veteran who'd seen war. "Excellent," Lord Edwyle said as he strode towards the courtyard, with the growing crowd following him in anticipation. "You shall lead the troop, Esser Castle, as I am clearly needed here to get things back in order." Chapter 18 Teaser. Dobby was having the time of his life. He had been waiting in the courtyard of Winterfell for Harry and Sirius when the bells began to ring. The sound was deafening, but Dobby ignored it as his attention was quickly caught by the reaction of the people around him. The castle had been roused and people were running everywhere in what he thought was a beautiful sort of chaos. People everywhere were suddenly working, fetching things, carrying things, building things, dressing up. He wasn't entirely sure what the bell meant, but the effect was pure heaven for Dobby. Dobby thought to himself that maybe he should ring some bells himself in the future, if that's what it took to get more people as excited by work as he usually was. Note: the next chapter is now up for free members on Patreon PanGalacticBard. If you would like to make comments or suggestions on the next draft chapter before it's published, you can head over there and have a look. If you would like to read even further ahead, or simply appreciate the story, I would welcome your donations. To be continued.